Hello and welcome to this delightful, clean, historical Western romance by Shelfie audiobook. We're thrilled to have you join us. Before we dive in, please take a moment to hit the subscribe button, give this audiobook a thumbs up, and share it with your friends. Your support in these small ways helps us bring you more heartwarming romance stories at no cost. Now settle in, get comfortable, and let yourself be swept away into a world of adventure, love, and unforgettable characters. Enjoy! This audiobook is copyrighted by Shelfie Bennett. Chapter 1: The Unexpected Gift. Lightning forked across the midnight sky, momentarily illuminating the crude log cabin where Grace Sullivan had spent the last 14 hours. The subsequent thunder rattled the shutters like the angry fist of God himself. But the sound that truly pierced Grace's concentration was Sarah Miller's agonized scream. "I can't push no more, Miss Grace. I just can't." Sarah's voice cracked as she collapsed back against the sweat-soaked pillows, her face ashen beneath the sheen of perspiration. Grace squeezed the laboring woman's hand, brushing damp tendrils of hair from her forehead. "Yes, you can, Sarah. I can see the baby's head. One more good push and your first little one will be here." Jacob Miller, hovering anxiously at his wife's shoulder, looked as though he might faint. The poor man hadn't slept in 2 days, not since his wife's water had broken with no labor following. Now, with Sarah's strength waning and the storm raging outside, Grace could see the terror etched in his weathered face. "The good Lord didn't bring you this far to fail now," Grace said firmly, meeting Sarah's pain-filled eyes. "Your babies need you to be strong. Just one more push." The word babies seemed to fortify the exhausted woman. They'd discovered hours ago that Sarah carried twins, a fact that had both thrilled and terrified the young farming couple. With renewed determination, Sarah gripped the edges of the cornhusk mattress and bore down with a guttural cry that rose above the howling wind. "That's it," Grace positioned her hands as the infant's head fully emerged. "The shoulders are coming. Yes, here we are." With practiced movements, Grace eased the slippery infant into the world, quickly clearing its mouth and nose. The baby boy announced his arrival with a lusty wail that brought tears to Jacob's eyes. "A son," Grace announced, her own voice trembling with emotion despite having attended countless births. She quickly tied off and cut the cord, then wrapped the squalling infant in a clean flannel cloth before passing him to his father. "Hold him close to your chest, Jacob, while I tend to the next one." The second delivery proceeded more swiftly, and within 10 minutes, Sarah was cradling a daughter against her breast while Jacob perched beside them, their son nestled in the crook of his arm. The look of wonderment on their faces made the exhaustion of the long night fade from Grace's bones. "2 perfect babies," she murmured, washing her hands in the basin of water that had been heated repeatedly throughout the night. "The Lord has blessed you twice over." Outside, the storm continued its assault. But inside the humble cabin, an almost reverent quiet had descended, broken only by the occasional whimper of the newborns and the soft crooning of their mother. Dr. Thomas Burnett arrived as Grace was instructing Sarah on feeding the twins. The elderly physician had been called to a ranch 10 miles south when Sarah's labor had begun, and though Grace had sent for him, she hadn't expected him to brave the storm. "Looks like you've managed just fine without me again, Miss Sullivan," he said after examining mother and babies. His blue eyes, faded with age but still sharp with intelligence, studied her face. "You're pale as a ghost, girl. When did you last eat or sleep?" Grace waved away his concern. "I'll rest when I get home." She began packing her midwife's satchel, clean cloths, herbal tinctures, the scissors she kept meticulously clean with strong whiskey. As the storm finally began to abate, giving way to the first tentative light of dawn, Grace and Dr. Burnett stepped onto the Miller's porch. The air smelled clean and fresh after the rain, with that peculiar crispness that seemed to make every detail of the landscape sharper. "That's the 3rd difficult birth you've handled without me this month," the doctor said, helping her secure her satchel to her saddle. "I'm beginning to think I should retire and leave the county in your capable hands." Grace brushed a strand of auburn hair from her face, tucking it back into the severe bun at the nape of her neck. "Nonsense. I just help with the birthing. You're the one who mends broken bones and treats consumption. And you'd make a fine physician if women were allowed such things," he countered, his expression softening. You've got a gift, Grace, a true calling. She ducked her head, uncomfortable with praise as always. I just do what needs doing. Speaking of doing, Dr. Burnett said, his tone becoming deliberately casual. Martha tells me that young Cooper at the Mercantile has been asking after you again. Grace sighed, gathering the reins of her tired mare. Then Martha should mind her own affairs. The boy's not the only one. Widow Jenkins' son, what's his name? The one who took over the blacksmith shop. Benjamin, Grace supplied, unable to keep a note of impatience from her voice. Yes, Benjamin. He inquired whether you might welcome a caller on Sunday last. The doctor's bushy eyebrows rose expectantly, and I hope you told him I'm far too occupied with my duties. You can't deliver babies forever, Grace, he said gently. You're 8 and 20 now? A woman needs a family of her own. The familiar ache bloomed in her chest. I have a family. I have you and Marta and every mother and child I've helped bring together. Dr. Burnett's weathered hand came to rest on her shoulder. It's not the same as having someone to come home to, someone to share your burdens and joys. I gave up on that dream years ago, she said softly, gathering her skirts to mount her horse. God had other plans for me. The good Lord works in mysterious ways, the doctor replied, helping her into the saddle. Don't be so quick to decide what he has in mind for your future. Grace managed a tired smile. I'll try to remember that. Good day, doctor. She guided her mare down the muddy track that led back to Cottonwood Springs. The town was just stirring to life as she skirted its edges. She preferred her small cabin a half-mile beyond the town proper, where the cottonwoods grew thick along the creek and she could hear birdsong instead of the clatter of wagons and shopkeepers. The morning was cool for early May, the storm having swept away the previous day's warmth. Her dress, damp from the birthing room and the lingering moisture in the air, clung uncomfortably to her skin. Grace longed for nothing more than a warm fire, a cup of willow bark tea, and her bed, in that order. Rounding the final bend in the trail, she caught sight of her cabin, nestled against the backdrop of rustling cottonwoods. The modest structure, built by her father's hands before fever had taken both her parents when she was 12, represented everything she valued: independence, quietude, and the freedom to follow her calling without a husband's permission or a town's prying eyes. As she approached, a peculiar sight on her porch brought her mare to a halt. A large wicker basket sat squarely before her door, its presence as unexpected as snow in August. "Hello," she called, suddenly alert despite her fatigue. When no response came, she dismounted carefully, looping the reins around the hitching post. The basket was covered with a fine woolen shawl, far too exquisite for any of the local women she knew. Grace approached cautiously, then jumped back with a gasp when the covering moved slightly and a tiny whimper emerged. "Sweet merciful heaven," she whispered, kneeling beside the basket and gently pulling back the shawl. A baby, no more than a few days old, gazed up at her with unfocused, deep blue eyes. The infant was wrapped in the most luxurious blanket Grace had ever seen. Fine cream-colored linen embroidered with gold thread that caught the morning light. Tucked beside the baby was a folded note. With trembling fingers, Grace opened it to find 3 words written in an elegant, educated hand. "Please protect Susan." Grace's breath caught in her throat. Quickly, she scanned the tree line and the trail leading to her cabin, but saw no sign of anyone. She listened intently, but heard only the whisper of leaves and the distant cry of a hawk. "Susan," she said softly, testing the name. The baby blinked owlishly at her. "Where is your mama, little one?" With practiced hands, Grace lifted the infant from the basket, cradling her against her chest. The baby was clean and appeared well fed, showing none of the distress one would expect from a child left exposed to the night's tempest. "Someone must have brought you just after the storm," she murmured, counting tiny fingers and toes, checking for any sign of illness or injury. The baby was perfect, from her wispy dark hair to her miniature shell-like ears. A sudden thought struck Grace. Holding the baby securely with one arm, she gathered the basket and carried everything inside. Once the door was closed behind her, she laid the infant on her bed and quickly checked the cabin's perimeter through each window, searching for any sign of the mother who must surely be nearby, perhaps ill or injured. but the surrounding woods stood silent, offering no clues. Returning to the baby, Grace carefully unwrapped the fine blanket. As she spread it out, her fingers traced the intricate gold embroidery, an elaborate design that centered around what appeared to be a family crest. A rearing horse stood proudly above a shield quartered with symbols she didn't recognize. A sword, a crown, something that might have been a rose and what looked like a mountain peak. "This is no ordinary blanket, Susan," she whispered, "and I suspect you're no ordinary child." The baby's only response was to wave tiny fists, her face scrunching momentarily before relaxing again. Grace rewrapped her snugly, then built up the fire in her small stone hearth. As warmth began to fill the cabin, she moved about with purpose, heating water and preparing a makeshift feeding bottle from a small glass vial fitted with a scrap of clean linen as a teat. The goat's milk she kept for her morning tea would have to do until she could arrange something better. As she fed the hungry infant, Grace's mind raced with questions. Who would abandon such a clearly well-cared-for child? Why here at her remote cabin? And most troublingly, what danger might Susan need protection from? "Well, little one," she said, watching the baby's eyes grow heavy as she suckled, "it seems God has decided to send me a family after all." The creak of wagon wheels and the distinctive clop of hooves along the muddy trail alerted Grace to a visitor. Still cradling Susan, she moved to the window, recognizing Sheriff Parker's dappled gelding as it approached her cabin. The lawman's weekly visits had become routine since the incident last autumn when a drifter had tried to break into her home, thinking a woman living alone made an easy target. He'd learned otherwise when he'd found himself staring down the barrel of her father's old Remington. Grace smoothed her wrinkled skirts and tucked wayward strands of hair back into her bun, painfully aware of her disheveled appearance after the long night. Before she could set Susan down, a firm knock rattled her door. "Coming," she called, deciding there was no point in hiding the infant. Sheriff Parker would need to know eventually. The lawman removed his hat as she opened the door, revealing salt and pepper hair cropped close to his head. His weathered face creased into a smile that quickly transformed into astonishment at the sight of the bundle in her arms. "Ms. Sullivan," he began, then faltered, his gaze fixed on Susan. "I wasn't aware you were expecting company of the small variety." Despite her exhaustion, Grace couldn't suppress a smile at his delicate phrasing. "I wasn't either, Sheriff. She arrived unannounced this morning while I was attending the Miller birth." Sheriff Parker's bushy eyebrows drew together. "Arrived? You mean someone left a child on your doorstep?" "In a basket on my porch," Grace confirmed, stepping back to allow him entry. "Please, come in. I've just fed her, but I could put some coffee on if you'd like." "Don't trouble yourself." The sheriff stepped inside, ducking slightly beneath the low door frame. His imposing height seemed at odds with the gentleness in his movements as he approached to peer at the baby's face. Beautiful little thing. Any notion who might have left her? Grace shook her head, then showed him the note and blanket. "Nothing but this. Whoever left her called her Susan and seemed desperate for her to be kept safe." Sheriff Parker examined the embroidered crest with a puzzled frown. "That's mighty fine work. Not the sort of thing you'd see around these parts." He handed the blanket back carefully. "You understand I'll need to make this official, Miss Sullivan. Abandoned children are a matter for the territorial authorities." A surge of protectiveness washed over Grace. And what would happen to her then? An orphanage in Austin? Or would she be handed off to the first family willing to take her in, regardless of their character? The sheriff's expression softened. "Now, Miss Sullivan, I know you have strong feelings about such matters, given your own circumstances. But there are procedures that must be followed." "The mother might return," Grace said quickly. "Perhaps she's ill or in some kind of trouble. She might have left Susan here temporarily, knowing I care for infants." Sheriff Parker rubbed his jaw, a habit he displayed when deliberating a difficult decision. "That's possible, I suppose." "Give me 3 days," Grace pleaded, surprising herself with the intensity of her desire to keep Susan close. "If the mother doesn't return by then, I'll bring Susan to town myself and we can file the official report." The sheriff studied her face for a long moment, then sighed. 3 days, Miss Sullivan. Not a day more, and you send word immediately if anyone comes looking for this child. You hear?" "Of course," Grace agreed, relief washing through her. "Thank you, Sheriff." He settled his hat back on his head. "Don't thank me yet. If no one comes for this child, there'll be questions that need answering. Foundlings aren't common in these parts." His expression grew troubled, and someone leaving a child with a note about protection suggests trouble might not be far behind. The implication sent a chill down Grace's spine. "I'll be vigilant," she promised. After the sheriff departed, Grace spent the afternoon tending to Susan's needs. She fashioned a makeshift cradle from a drawer lined with soft flannel, bathed the infant in warm water scented with a few drops of lavender oil, and prepared more goat's milk, which she warmed carefully over the fire. As dusk approached, casting long shadows through the cabin windows, Grace felt the full weight of her sleepless night pressing down upon her. Yet despite her bone-deep weariness, a curious contentment had settled over her. She carried Susan and a light shawl out to the porch, settling into the rocking chair her father had crafted as a wedding gift for her mother. The air had cooled with the setting sun, carrying the sweet scent of wild honeysuckle that grew along the creek. Cicadas had begun their evening chorus, punctuated by the occasional throaty croak of bullfrogs. In the distance, a whippoorwill called plaintively to its mate. Susan stirred against her chest, tiny fingers flexing like the delicate petals of a morning glory opening to the sun. Grace adjusted the blanket around her, marveling at how perfectly the child fit in the crook of her arm, as if that space had been created solely for this purpose. "You've had quite a day, little one," she murmured, rocking gently. "So have I, come to that." The fading light burnished the western sky in shades of amber and rose, painting the undersides of scattered clouds with gold. Grace began to hum softly, the melody of a hymn her mother had sung on countless evenings just like this one. The words came back to her unbidden, a tender reminder of love long past but never forgotten. She sang quietly of God's watchful care, of angels keeping guard through darkest night, of love that never faltered. Her voice, though untrained, carried the emotion of someone who had known both sorrow and joy in equal measure. As twilight deepened into dusk and the first stars appeared overhead, Susan slept peacefully against her heart. In that moment of perfect stillness, Grace felt a certainty settle over her soul, as tangible as the child in her arms. "I don't know why your mother left you with me," she whispered, "or what dangers might be following you. But I swear before God and these stars as witness, I will protect you with everything I have." Her voice caught as she continued. "Perhaps the Lord sent you to me as much as he sent me to you. Either way, Susan, you are not alone. Not anymore." A gentle breeze stirred the cottonwood leaves, their silver undersides catching the last light like countless stars fallen to earth. Grace continued rocking, watching night claim the land that stretched before her. A land of harsh beauty and surprising tenderness, not unlike life itself. Tomorrow would bring its challenges. Questions would need answering, preparations made. But tonight, in this moment between day and darkness, Grace Sullivan held close the unexpected gift she'd been given and allowed herself to hope, just a little, that the emptiness she'd carried for so long might finally have found its purpose. Chapter 2: The Ranger's Arrival. A plume of dust rose along the eastern road into Cottonwood Springs, golden in the afternoon sunlight. Silas Jenkins, dozing on a bench outside the general store, straightened his arthritic back and squinted toward the approaching rider. These days, strangers meant either trouble or business, sometimes both. In a town as small as theirs, either was cause for interest. "Rider, come in," he called through the open door to anyone within earshot, then settled back to observe. The man who materialized from the dust cloud sat tall in the saddle, his posture speaking of long days spent astride the powerful chestnut gelding beneath him. A dark hat shaded features weathered by sun and wind, but it was the silver star pinned to his vest that drew every eye on the street. Even the school children, released from their lessons and playing a boisterous game of tag, fell silent as he passed. Texas Rangers didn't visit Cottonwood Springs without purpose. Nathaniel Hayes guided his mount down the town's main thoroughfare, ignoring the stares that followed his progress. 3 weeks of hard riding had left him trail-worn and irritable. his normally close-trimmed beard now a dark tangle that did little to soften the hard angles of his jaw. His clothes carried the dust of a half-dozen counties, and his eyes, a piercing gray that reminded folks of storm clouds, scanned every face, every doorway with the vigilance of a man who'd learned the cost of inattention. He'd tracked men across parched deserts and through swollen rivers, pursued them from the Red River to the Mexican border, but this particular pursuit felt different. It wasn't just justice driving him this time, it was a promise made to a dying woman. A promise he'd given little thought to until he'd learned that Jeremiah Montgomery's men were also hunting the child. The sheriff's office stood at the far end of the street, a squat building of weathered planks with a small adjoining jail cell. Nathaniel reined in his horse, dismounting with the fluid movement of a man more at home in the saddle than on his own 2 feet. His spurs jingled softly as his boots hit the packed earth. "Easy, Samson," he murmured, looping the reins around the hitching post. He patted the gelding's sweat-dampened neck, then retrieved his canteen and poured water into his hat for the horse to drink. "We might have found her this time." The sheriff's door opened before Nathaniel reached it. A tall man with iron gray hair and a neatly trimmed mustache stepped onto the porch, thumbs hooked into his belt near a well-worn holster. "Figured you were headed my way when I saw that star," the man said, his tone neither welcoming nor hostile. "Sheriff Thomas Parker?" "Ranger Nathaniel Hayes." He touched the brim of his hat in a gesture of respect. "Mind if I step inside? Got business that's best discussed in private?" Sheriff Parker studied him for a moment, then nodded and stepped aside. The office smelled of tobacco, gunpowder, and the faint mustiness of old wanted posters. A pot-bellied stove stood cold in the corner, unnecessary in the mild May weather. "Coffee?" Parker offered, gesturing to a dented pot on a small sideboard. "Obliged." Nathaniel removed his hat, revealing dark hair streaked with sweat and trail dust. "Been riding since before dawn." The sheriff poured 2 mugs of coffee that looked like it had been brewing since sunup, then settled behind a desk stacked with papers and ledgers. "What brings a ranger to Cottonwood Springs? We're mostly peaceful, except when the cattle drives come through." Nathaniel took a seat across from him, the wooden chair creaking beneath his weight. "I'm tracking a child," he said, watching Parker's face carefully. "Infant girl less than 2 weeks old, traveling with her mother, or was until about 4 days ago." Something flickered in Sheriff Parker's eyes, recognition, perhaps concern. "That's an unusual assignment for a ranger." "The circumstances are unusual." Nathaniel set his coffee down untouched. "The child is Susan Montgomery, daughter of Catherine Montgomery and Jeremiah Montgomery." The sheriff's hand stilled halfway to his mouth. "Jeremiah Montgomery, the outlaw?" "The same. After his death in that shootout near El Paso, his men have been hunting the child." Nathaniel leaned forward. "I have reason to believe Catherine Montgomery was headed this way before she disappeared." Parker's expression had grown guarded. "What's your interest in this child, Ranger?" "Far as I know, rangers don't typically involve themselves in family matters, even those of notorious outlaws." "Catherine was helping us," Nathaniel said quietly. "Providing information on Montgomery's operations, the locations of stolen cattle and money. She did it to protect her child, hoping to build a new life away from her husband's influence." He paused, the memory of Catherine's pale face and desperate eyes still vivid in his mind. "I gave her my word that if anything happened to her, I'd ensure her daughter's safety." The sheriff studied him for a long moment, then exhaled slowly. 3 days ago, a baby girl was left on the doorstep of our local midwife. No sign of the mother, just a note asking that the child be protected." He hesitated. "The infant was wrapped in a fancy blanket with some kind of embroidered design on it." Nathaniel's heart quickened. "A family crest? Horse above a quartered shield?" Parker nodded. "The midwife has the child. I was planning to send word to the territorial authorities tomorrow if the mother didn't return. I need to see the baby." Nathaniel stood, setting his hat back on his head with grim determination. "And I'll need directions to this midwife's home." "Hold on now." Sheriff Parker rose as well, his expression hardening. "Ms. Sullivan is one of the most respected women in this county. If you're planning to charge in there making demands..." "The men hunting this child won't care about your midwife's reputation, Sheriff," Nathaniel cut in. They'll burn that cabin to the ground with her and the baby inside if it serves their purpose. Parker's face paled slightly at the blunt assessment. Grace Sullivan lives a half-mile beyond town, along the creek where the cottonwoods grow thick. Follow the main road east until you pass the last buildings, then take the trail north. His gaze sharpened. But you listen here, Ranger. Miss Sullivan's been through enough heartache in her life. You treat her with respect, or you'll answer to me before any law you might represent. Nathaniel respected the warning for what it was, a man protecting one of his own. He gave a curt nod. I've no quarrel with your midwife, Sheriff, but that child is in danger every minute she remains here. 10 minutes later, Nathaniel guided Sampson along a narrow trail bordered by wild grasses and occasional bursts of Indian paintbrush. The afternoon heat had begun to soften as the sun slipped westward, casting long shadows from the cottonwoods that gave the town its name. In the distance, a small cabin came into view, situated in a natural clearing near a lazy bend in the creek. As he approached, Nathaniel saw a woman in the yard, hanging white linens on a clothesline strung between two trees. Even from a distance, there was an efficiency to her movements that spoke of capability and purpose. Her calico dress, the color of autumn leaves, was cinched at a narrow waist, and her auburn hair was restrained in a practical knot at the nape of her neck. She glanced up at the sound of his horse, one hand reflexively moving to shield her eyes from the sun. For a moment she stood perfectly still, a damp sheet forgotten in her hands. Then she quickly stepped toward the cabin as if preparing to retreat inside. "Miss Sullivan?" Nathaniel called, reining Sampson to a halt at a respectful distance. "Grace Sullivan?" She remained where she was, her posture straight as a lodgepole pine. "Yes," she answered, her voice clear and steady despite the wariness evident in her stance. "May I help you, sir?" Nathaniel dismounted, loosely securing Sampson's reins to a low-hanging branch. As he approached, he noted her eyes, a striking shade of green flecked with gold, assessing him with undisguised suspicion. "My name is Nathaniel Hayes," he said, touching the brim of his hat. "I'm with the Texas Rangers." He gestured toward the silver star on his vest, watching her expression closely. Her gaze flicked to the badge, then back to his face. "We don't get many Rangers in Cottonwood Springs, Mr. Hayes. What business brings you to my door?" "I believe you've recently taken in an infant, a baby girl." The change in Grace Sullivan's demeanor was immediate and dramatic. Her shoulders tensed, her chin lifted, and something fierce kindled in those remarkable eyes. "Sheriff Parker told me he'd given me 3 days," she said, her voice now edged with steel. "Today's the 3rd day." "I'm not here on the sheriff's behalf, ma'am," Nathaniel clarified. "I'm here about the child specifically. I need to see her." "Why?" The single word contained volumes of distrust. "It's a matter of some urgency," he said, deliberately keeping his tone even. "The child may be in danger." Grace's hand closed around a nearby clothespin with such force that her knuckles whitened. "You haven't answered my question, Ranger Hayes. Why do you want to see Susan? What is your interest in an abandoned infant?" The name confirmed it. Nathaniel took a step closer, only to find his path blocked as Grace moved deliberately between him and the cabin door. "Miss Sullivan, I understand your caution, but time is of the essence. The men who are looking for that child won't ask politely before they burn this place to the ground." Her face paled slightly, but her resolve didn't waver. "Then perhaps you should explain yourself fully before making demands. I'm responsible for Susan's welfare, and I won't surrender her to anyone, badge or no badge, without knowing exactly what's happening." Nathaniel suppressed a flash of frustration. Every minute spent here increased the risk. Yet he couldn't fault her protective instinct. It was precisely this quality that had likely led Catherine Montgomery to leave her daughter in this woman's care. "The baby you call Susan is the daughter of Catherine Montgomery," he explained, keeping his voice low. "Her father was Jeremiah Montgomery, leader of one of the most dangerous outlaw gangs in the territory. Catherine was helping me gather evidence against her husband before his death in a shootout 2 weeks ago." Grace's expression registered shock, but she remained silent, waiting for him to continue. "Catherine fled after Montgomery's death, knowing his men would kill both her and the baby out of vengeance, and to prevent the child from inheriting Montgomery's considerable fortune. I've been tracking her for days. The trail led here to Cottonwood Springs." "And where is Susan's mother now?" Grace asked. a new tension threading through her voice. Nathaniel hesitated. This was the part he'd been dreading. I don't know for certain. Her trail disappeared near the creek about a mile south of here. There were signs of a struggle. Understanding dawned in Grace's eyes, followed by a flash of grief that seemed too personal for a woman who had never met Catherine Montgomery. You believe she's dead? It wasn't a question, but Nathaniel nodded anyway. I believe she managed to bring her daughter to safety before Montgomery's men caught up with her. She would have recognized a midwife as someone who could be trusted with an infant. Grace turned slightly, her gaze moving toward the cabin where presumably the baby slept. When she looked back at Nathaniel, there was a new resolve in her expression. If what you're saying is true, Ranger Hayes, then Susan has lost both her parents and is being hunted by dangerous men. Her voice held a quiet intensity. Before I allow you anywhere near her, I need to know your intentions. What do you plan to do with her? The question brought Nathaniel up short. In truth, he'd been so focused on finding the child that he hadn't thought much beyond that immediate goal. He'd given Catherine his word that he would protect her daughter, but the practicalities of that promise now loomed large. My first priority is keeping her safe, he said finally. Montgomery's men are likely already on their way to Cottonwood Springs. We need to move quickly. That's not an answer, Grace countered, her gaze unwavering. What happens to Susan after you've removed her from danger? An orphanage? Some distant relative who never knew her parents? Or will she simply become a ward of whatever territory you happen to be passing through? The challenge in her tone provoked a spark of irritation. With all due respect, Miss Sullivan, I'm trying to prevent that child from being murdered in her cradle. Perhaps we could discuss her future schooling and marriage prospects once we've ensured she lives to see her first birthday. Grace's cheeks flushed with color, but her voice remained steady. I won't release Susan into your custody without knowing exactly what that means for her. If you truly gave her mother your word, Ranger, then surely you had some plan beyond simply finding her. They stood facing each other in the lengthening shadows of late afternoon, at an impasse neither had anticipated. In the charged silence, a soft cry emanated from within the cabin. The unmistakable sound of an infant awakening from sleep. Grace glanced toward the door, clearly torn between her protective stance and the baby's needs. Finally, she fixed Nathaniel with a penetrating look. You may come inside and explain everything to me properly, she said, her tone making it clear this was not a concession but a command. But understand this, Ranger Hayes. Regardless of who her parents were or what danger follows her, that child is under my protection now, and I will not surrender her to anyone unless I'm absolutely certain it's in her best interest. Without waiting for his response, Grace turned and strode toward the cabin, her back straight and her step purposeful. Nathaniel watched her go, caught between admiration for her courage and exasperation at the delay. But as he followed her toward the small dwelling, he couldn't help but think that if Catherine Montgomery had intentionally sought out Grace Sullivan, perhaps she'd shown more wisdom than he'd initially given her credit for. Inside, the cabin was modest but meticulously kept. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, its hearth swept clean. Hand-braided rugs softened the plank floor, and simple curtains of unbleached muslin filtered the late afternoon light. In one corner stood a narrow bed covered with a faded quilt. In another, he spotted the makeshift cradle, a drawer lined with soft flannel. Susan lay awake in her nest of blankets, tiny fists waving in the air. Grace immediately went to her, lifting the infant with practiced hands and cradling her close. She's hungry, Grace explained, settling into a rocking chair and adjusting her shawl to provide modest cover as she prepared to feed the baby with a small glass bottle. You can continue your explanation while I tend to her. Nathaniel removed his hat, suddenly aware of the intimacy of the domestic scene before him. He remained standing, his tall frame seeming to fill the small space. Jeremiah Montgomery was shot dead 2 weeks ago near El Paso, he began, keeping his voice low. He'd been moving stolen cattle across the border when a rival gang ambushed his men. In the chaos that followed, Catherine took the baby and fled. Grace's hand stilled momentarily as she fed Susan. You said she was helping you. Was she a criminal as well? No. Nathaniel's response came quickly, perhaps too quickly. Catherine was forced into marriage with Montgomery. Her father owed him money, and Montgomery took her as payment. The memory of Catherine's haunted eyes when she'd first approached him for help still burned in his mind. When she discovered she was with child, she reached out to me, offering information in exchange for protection, for herself and her baby. Grace's expression softened with understanding. She was desperate to give her child a better life. Montgomery accumulated substantial wealth during his years of raiding, Nathaniel continued. Cattle, land, gold, much of it hidden away. As his legal wife, Catherine would inherit everything upon his death, and as her child, Susan is now the legitimate heir to Montgomery's fortune. And his men want to eliminate any claim to their ill-gotten gain, Grace concluded, her arms tightening protectively around Susan. His brother, Silas Montgomery, has taken control of the gang. He was always the more cunning of the two, but Jeremiah had the charisma to lead. Nathaniel moved to the window, scanning the trail leading back toward town. Silas won't rest until the child is dead, and any legal claim to Jeremiah's fortune is eliminated. Grace traced a gentle finger along Susan's cheek as the baby suckled contentedly, unaware of the danger surrounding her. What proof do you have of any of this, Ranger Hayes? I have only your word that Susan is who you claim she is. Nathaniel reached inside his vest and withdrew a small daguerreotype, carefully preserved in a leather pouch. He handed it to Grace. Catherine gave me this when she first asked for my help. Grace studied the image, a beautiful young woman with dark hair and eyes that seemed to hold a profound sadness even in the formal pose. Despite the differences in their features, there was something in the set of the woman's jaw that reminded Grace of little Susan. She looks so young, Grace murmured. Barely 20, Nathaniel confirmed. She'd been Montgomery's wife for less than 2 years. Grace handed back the image, her skepticism visibly wavering. Even if everything you say is true, what right do you have to take Susan? You're not family. You're not even... A sharp crack split the air, the unmistakable sound of a rifle shot coming from the direction of town. Nathaniel was at the window in 2 strides, his body tense as he peered through the curtains. "They're here," he said grimly. "Sooner than I expected." "Who's here?" Grace asked, though the sudden pallor of her face suggested she already knew. "Montgomery's men. They must have followed my trail." He turned to her, all pretense of patience gone. "We need to leave. Now." Another shot rang out, followed by faint shouting. "Sheriff Parker," Grace began, "is one man against at least half a dozen hardened outlaws," Nathaniel cut in. "If we don't move quickly, all that man's courage won't mean a thing when they torture your whereabouts out of some poor shopkeeper." The blunt assessment seemed to reach Grace in a way nothing else had. She rose swiftly, Susan clutched against her chest. "What do you need?" Nathaniel asked, already moving toward the door to retrieve his saddlebags from Samson. Grace's response was immediate and practical. "There's a carpet bag under the bed. I need diapers for Susan, the bottle, and goat's milk from the spring house." Her voice remained steady despite the urgency of their situation. "And my father's rifle from above the door." Nathaniel nodded approvingly at her presence of mind. "Pack only what you can carry. We'll be traveling light and fast." While Grace gathered Susan's necessities, Nathaniel retrieved his saddlebags and the Winchester rifle secured to his saddle. When he returned, Grace had donned a sturdy shawl and was filling a small leather pouch with items from a cabinet near the hearth. "Medicinal herbs," she explained briefly. "Susan's had colic." Her composure impressed him. Many women would have dissolved into panic or hysterics by now. "Is there another way out?" he asked, returning to the window to survey the landscape. "They'll be watching the main trail." Grace nodded, securing Susan in a sling across her chest that left her hands free. "Through the back and down to the creek. We can follow the water to hide our tracks." She reached for a tin box on a high shelf. "My savings. It's not much, but..." "Bring it," Nathaniel said. "We don't know how long we'll be running." She slipped the box into the carpet bag, then reached for the Remington rifle mounted above the door. With practiced movements, she checked that it was loaded before slinging it over her shoulder. "You know how to use that?" Nathaniel asked, unable to hide his surprise. A shadow of a smile crossed Grace's face. "My father taught me well enough. I've lived alone for years, Ranger Hayes. A woman in my position can't afford to be helpless." Another volley of shots echoed from town, closer now. Nathaniel moved to the back door, gesturing for Grace to follow. "Stay low and move quickly," he instructed. "The creek bed is our best chance. The water will mask our scent if they bring dogs." They slipped out into the gathering dusk, keeping to the shadows of the cottonwoods. Nathaniel led Samson by the reins, the horse moving with surprising quietness for such a large animal. Grace followed, one hand supporting Susan in her sling, the other clutching the carpet bag. They had nearly reached the creek when the sound of approaching hoofbeats caused them to freeze. Nathaniel pulled Grace into the shadow of a massive cottonwood, his body shielding both her and the baby as riders appeared on the trail leading to her cabin. "That's it," a harsh voice called out. "The midwife's place. Check inside." From their hiding place, Grace watched as 4 men dismounted in her yard. Even in the fading light, she could see the ruthlessness in their bearing, the casual way they handled their weapons. One kicked open her door while another circled toward the spring house. "Empty!" came the shout from inside her home. "But they ain't been gone long. Coffee's still warm." "Burn it," ordered a tall man who remained mounted, his face shadowed beneath his hat brim. "Burn it all. I want a message sent." Grace's breath caught in her throat as one of the men emerged from her cabin with the oil lamp from her table. With deliberate malice, he hurled it through the open door. Flames erupted almost instantly, catching on the dry wood and furnishings. Something broke inside Grace as the fire took hold, engulfing the little home that had sheltered her through loneliness and grief, that had witnessed her happiest memories of her parents, that had been her one constant in a world of uncertainty. A small sound escaped her. Not quite a cry, but close enough that Nathaniel's hand tightened on her arm in warning. The flames rose higher, orange and gold against the deepening blue of twilight. Grace watched as years of careful tending, of making do and building something uniquely hers, disappeared in ravenous flames. The heat reached them even from this distance, carrying the acrid scent of burning fabric and wood. "We need to move," Nathaniel whispered, his mouth close to her ear. "While they're distracted." Susan stirred against Grace's chest, perhaps sensing her distress. The tiny movement broke through Grace's paralysis, reminding her of what truly mattered. This child, this innocent life entrusted to her care, was worth more than any possession. Nathaniel tugged gently at her arm, urging her toward the creek. "I'm sorry," he murmured, his voice rough with unexpected empathy. "But we can't stay." Grace tore her gaze from the burning cabin and met his eyes. In the reflected firelight, she saw not the hard lawman who had arrived on her doorstep, but a man who understood loss. Without a word, she nodded and turned toward the creek, one hand protectively cradling Susan's head against her heart. As they descended into the creek bed, the sound of rushing water merged with the crackling of flames. Behind them, Montgomery's men continued their destruction, unaware that their quarry slipped away with each passing moment. Ahead lay only uncertainty, a journey begun in violence and necessity. Grace took one final look at the burning silhouette of her home before the creek bend would hide it from view. Then, with a deep breath, she turned away and followed Nathaniel into the gathering darkness, carrying her most precious possession, an orphaned child, who had, in the space of mere days, become the center of her world. Chapter 3. A Necessity. Dawn found them deep in the piney hills, 10 miles northwest of Cottonwood Springs. They had traveled through the night, following creek beds and game trails, stopping only when necessary to rest Nathaniel's horse or to tend to Susan's needs. Grace's legs ached from hours of walking, and exhaustion clouded her mind, but she had refused Nathaniel's repeated offers to ride while he led Samson on foot. The abandoned trapper's cabin appeared suddenly through the trees, a crude structure of rough-hewn logs chinked with mud and moss. Its roof sagged in the middle, and the door hung askew on leather hinges, but after a night spent in the open with Montgomery's men potentially on their trail, it looked like a palace to Grace's weary eyes. "Wait here," Nathaniel instructed, handing her Samson's reins before drawing his Colt revolver and approaching the cabin cautiously. Grace watched, Susan sleeping against her chest as Nathaniel circled the structure, peering through its single grimy window before pushing open the door with the barrel of his gun. He disappeared inside, and for several long moments, the only sounds were the whisper of pine needles overhead and the soft nickering of the tired horse. "It's clear," Nathaniel called at last, appearing in the doorway. Not much to look at, but it'll shelter us for now. The cabin's interior smelled of damp earth and old smoke. Dust motes danced in the shafts of early light streaming through cracks in the walls. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, its hearth still containing the ashes of fires long cold. A crude table, a three-legged stool, and a straw-stuffed mattress in one corner constituted the entirety of the furnishing. "I'll see to Samson," Nathaniel said, taking a water skin from his saddlebags. "There's a stream about 50 yards back. Why don't you and Susan rest?" Grace nodded, too exhausted to argue. She sank onto the edge of the mattress, wincing at the musty smell, but too bone-weary to care. Susan stirred in her sling, her tiny face scrunching as she began to wake. "Shh, sweet girl," Grace murmured, easing the infant out of the... "I know you're hungry. Just a moment." She reached for her carpet bag, retrieving the bottle and the precious flask of goat's milk that was rapidly diminishing. As she prepared Susan's meal, she glanced around the cabin, taking stock of their surroundings more carefully. Spiderwebs draped the ceiling corners, and a field mouse scurried along the floorboards near the wall before disappearing into a crack. The place had clearly been abandoned for some time, but the roof appeared mostly sound, and the walls would provide shelter from the wind that had picked up as morning advanced. Susan took the bottle eagerly, her blue eyes fixing on Grace's face with an intensity that tugged at something deep in her heart. Despite the danger, despite losing her home and everything she possessed, Grace found herself smiling down at the infant. "You're worth it all, little one," she whispered. "Every bit of it." The door creaked open as Nathaniel returned, stamping mud from his boots before entering fully. He carried an armload of wood, which he deposited near the fireplace. "Storm's coming," he said, nodding toward the single window where darkening clouds were visible above the tree line. "We're lucky to have found shelter." Grace finished feeding Susan, then held her against her shoulder, patting gently to ease the air from her tiny stomach. But rather than settling back to sleep as she usually did, Susan began to fuss, her whimpers quickly building to distressed cries. "What's wrong with her?" Nathaniel asked, frowning as he knelt to arrange kindling in the fireplace. "She's probably overtired," Grace replied, rising to pace the small cabin, "and the strange surroundings aren't helping." Susan's cries intensified, her face turning an alarming shade of red as her tiny fists waved in protest at whatever discomfort plagued her. Grace tried every soothing technique she knew, rocking, patting, humming softly, but nothing seemed to help. After 15 minutes of uninterrupted wailing, even Grace's practiced patience began to fray. She had gone too long without sleep, and the events of the previous day pressed heavily on her mind. Every cry from Susan seemed to drill directly into her skull. "Let me try," Nathaniel said suddenly, rising from where he'd coaxed a small fire to life. Grace stared at him in surprise. Since finding them in Cottonwood Springs, he'd maintained a careful distance from the baby, focusing solely on their safety and practical needs. "You?" she couldn't help asking. A hint of color touched his weathered cheeks. "I had 3 younger siblings," he explained gruffly. "My ma died when the youngest was still in swaddling clothes. I did my share of child-minding." Skeptical, but desperate for relief, Grace carefully transferred the screaming infant to Nathaniel's arms. His large, calloused hands that had likely taken lives in his role as a lawman, cradled Susan with unexpected gentleness. The contradiction wasn't lost on Grace. "There now, little one," he murmured, his voice dropping to a rumbling bass that seemed to come from deep in his chest. "That's enough of that ruckus. You're keeping your Miss Grace from her rest, and that won't do at all." To Grace's astonishment, Susan's piercing cries gradually subsided to hiccuping whimpers as Nathaniel held her against his shoulder, one broad hand supporting her head while the other patted her back in a slow, steady rhythm. He began to pace the cabin as Grace had done, but with a slight bouncing motion to his step that seemed to further soothe the infant. "Sometimes they just want something different," he explained, noting Grace's amazed expression. "A deeper voice, a different set of arms. Don't take it personally. She'll be wanting you again soon enough." Grace sank back onto the mattress, the adrenaline that had kept her going suddenly draining away. "You're full of surprises, Ranger Hayes." A faint smile touched his lips. "Nathaniel," he corrected. "Seems we're past formalities considering the circumstances." She nodded, then stifled a yawn behind her hand. "How long do you think we'll need to stay here?" Surely Montgomery's men will move on once they realize we've left the area. Nathaniel's expression grew serious again. Men like that don't give up easily, especially with a fortune at stake. We need to assume they're still searching. He glanced down at Susan, now drowsing against his chest. And we need to make plans for her safety. What options do we have? Grace asked. I still don't understand why Catherine Montgomery would leave her daughter with me, a stranger, rather than taking Susan with her. Nathaniel eased himself onto the three-legged stool, still cradling the now sleeping infant. My guess is she knew she was being followed and wanted to give Susan a chance. Catherine was smart, resourceful. She must have seen something in you that told her you could be trusted. The thought brought little comfort to Grace. But what now? Where can we take Susan that Montgomery's brother won't find her? Outside, the first drops of rain began to patter against the cabin roof. Nathaniel gazed into the small fire for a long moment before answering. I've been giving that considerable thought, he said finally. I made a promise to Catherine that I would protect her daughter. I intend to keep that promise. But you said yourself that Montgomery's men won't stop searching, Grace pointed out. You can't spend the rest of your life guarding a child. No, he agreed. And even if I could, there's the matter of legal guardianship. As a single man with no family connection to Susan, I have no legal right to keep her. The courts would eventually place her in an orphanage or with a family designated by the state. Grace's heart clenched at the thought. She had seen what happened to children in such institutions. The lack of individual attention, the vulnerability to disease and mistreatment. Susan, bright-eyed and alert despite her tender age, deserved better. There might be a solution, Nathaniel continued, his tone carefully neutral. A way to provide Susan with legal protection while we determine the best course for her future. Something in his manner made Grace straighten, suddenly wary. What kind of solution? Nathaniel met her gaze directly. Marriage. The word hung in the air between them, as startling as if he'd fired his gun in the small cabin. Marriage? Grace repeated, certain she had misunderstood. A marriage of convenience, he clarified. A legal arrangement that would make us Susan's guardians in the eyes of the law. It would give me the authority to protect both of you more effectively, and it would provide a cover for us to travel without raising questions. Grace stared at him, speechless. Of all the possibilities she had considered since fleeing her burning home, this had never crossed her mind. I know it's unexpected, Nathaniel continued, when she didn't respond. But it would be a temporary solution, dissolved once Susan's mother is found or the threat is eliminated. In the meantime, it would give Susan the protection of a family name and legal guardians who have her best interests at heart. You can't be serious. Grace found her voice at last. You're proposing we enter into a false marriage based on a crisis that began 2 days ago? We're strangers to each other. I'm not suggesting anything improper, Nathaniel said, a faint flush darkening his tanned face. It would be a matter of paperwork, nothing more, a business arrangement to protect a child who has no one else. Rain drummed harder on the roof, and a gust of wind drove drops through the cracks in the walls. Susan stirred in Nathaniel's arms but didn't wake. And what if Catherine Montgomery is truly dead? Grace asked quietly. What then? How long would this temporary arrangement last? Until Susan is safe, he answered simply. Until Montgomery's brother is captured or killed, and his men no longer pose a threat. After that, we could arrange an annulment, and you would be free to return to your life. My life? Grace gave a bitter laugh. My home is ashes, Ranger. Everything I owned was in that cabin. All the more reason to consider my proposal, he countered. I have savings. As my wife, even in name only, you and Susan would be provided for while you rebuild. The practicality of his argument couldn't be denied, yet something in Grace rebelled at the cold calculation of it all. Marriage had been sacred to her parents, a union based on love and shared faith, not convenience and danger. I need time to think, she said finally, and to pray for guidance. Nathaniel nodded, carefully rising with Susan still asleep against his chest. The storm's likely to keep us here through the night. Take whatever time you need. He gently transferred the sleeping infant back to Grace's arms. I'll keep watch and see about finding us something to eat. As he stepped outside despite the increasing rain, Grace settled back on the mattress, arranging Susan beside her. The infant's peaceful face contrasted sharply with the turmoil in Grace's heart. She thought of her parents, their quiet devotion to each other, the gentle touches and shared smiles that had filled their home with warmth. Her father reading from the Bible each evening, her mother's hand resting on his as they bowed their heads in prayer. Their marriage had been a true partnership, founded on mutual respect and deep affection. How different from what Nathaniel proposed, a marriage in name only, a legal fiction created for protection rather than companionship. Yet as Grace stroked Susan's velvety cheek, she acknowledged the harsh reality of their situation. The child needed protection that neither she nor Nathaniel could provide alone. Without legal standing, either one of them could lose Susan to the system, or worse, to Montgomery's vengeful brother. As darkness fell and the storm intensified, Grace slipped into an exhausted sleep. Susan nestled safely beside her. Her dreams were fragmented, flames consuming her home, men with hard eyes searching through the ashes, her mother's voice reciting familiar scripture, "Perfect love casteth out fear." She woke before dawn to find Nathaniel seated by the door, his rifle across his knees, his gaze fixed on the gray light beginning to seep through the window. Susan still slept, her tiny chest rising and falling with each breath. "I've been thinking about your proposal," Grace said softly, sitting up on the edge of the mattress. Nathaniel turned toward her, his expression carefully neutral. "And I'll agree to it," she said, "but I have conditions of my own." Interest flickered in his gray eyes. "I'm listening." "First, this arrangement will remain exactly what you described, a business matter, nothing more." She met his gaze steadily. "Second, you will treat me as a partner in decisions regarding Susan, not as someone to be protected or directed." Nathaniel nodded slowly. "That seems fair." "And third," Grace continued, "you will help me search for Catherine Montgomery. If there's any chance she's alive, Susan deserves to know her mother." Nathaniel's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "I believe Catherine is dead, Grace. I followed her trail to where it ended in signs of struggle. There was blood. But no body," Grace pointed out. "Until we know for certain, I won't give up hope for Susan's sake." She lifted her chin. "Those are my terms. Do you accept them?" For a long moment, Nathaniel studied her, his expression unreadable in the dim light. Then he inclined his head in a single, decisive nod. "I accept." Outside, the storm had passed, leaving the world washed clean. A pale sun edged above the eastern hills, catching on droplets that clung to every pine needle and blade of grass, transforming the forest into a sea of diamonds. Susan stirred and whimpered, ready for her morning feeding. As Grace prepared the bottle, she felt oddly calm, as though the decision, practical rather than romantic, born of necessity rather than affection, had somehow been inevitable from the moment she found Susan on her porch. "We should head for Justice Mills," Nathaniel said, rolling up his bedroll. "Judge Wilson there is a fair man. He'll perform the ceremony without asking too many questions, especially when I explain it involves a ranger's duty." Grace nodded, focusing on feeding Susan rather than the enormity of what she had just agreed to. "How soon can we leave?" "Within the hour," Nathaniel replied. "The sooner we establish our cover as a family, the sooner Susan will be." A family. The word echoed in Grace's mind as she gazed down at the infant in her arms. Not the family she had once dreamed of, certainly. Not the loving marriage her parents had shared or the children born of that union. Instead, a makeshift family created by crisis, bound together by duty and the fierce need to protect an innocent life. Yet as Susan's tiny hand curled around her finger, Grace wondered if perhaps God's plan sometimes took unexpected paths. If the emptiness in her heart, the longing for a child of her own, might find fulfillment in this strange new journey she was about to begin. "Ready?" Nathaniel asked, standing in the doorway with their meager belongings packed and ready. Grace rose, securing Susan in her sling. "Ready," she answered, stepping forward to meet whatever lay ahead. Not as Grace Sullivan, midwife of Cottonwood Springs, but as the soon-to-be wife of Texas Ranger Nathaniel Hayes, guardian to an infant heiress, with a price on her tiny head. Justice Mills is about a day's ride southwest of here, Nathaniel explained as they emerged from the cabin into the pearl gray morning. Judge Wilson is a fair man, served with the Texas militia before the war. He understands that sometimes unusual measures are necessary. Grace adjusted Susan's sling as Nathaniel prepared Samson for their journey. Will he ask many questions? Some, Nathaniel admitted, tightening the cinch on his saddle, but he's respected my judgment in the past. I'll explain enough to satisfy him without revealing Susan's true identity. And what will that explanation be? Grace asked, accepting his help to mount Samson. Nathaniel swung up behind her, his solid presence at her back both reassuring and disconcerting. A young family heading to Fort Worth for a fresh start, a ranger escorting his new wife and child after trouble in her hometown. His voice took on a touch of wry humor. The best stories contain elements of truth, Miss Sullivan. Grace, she corrected. If we're to be married, even in name only, you should at least use my given name. They set off through the dripping forest, following game trails that only Nathaniel seemed able to discern. The morning warmed as they rode, sunlight filtering through the canopy in dappled patterns that shifted with each breeze. Birds called from the branches overhead, and twice they startled deer from their path. Grace found herself lulled by the steady rhythm of the horse beneath her and the warmth of Susan against her chest. Despite the strangeness of her circumstances, riding through the wilderness with a man she barely knew, agreeing to a marriage of convenience, fleeing from dangerous outlaws, she felt oddly at peace. Perhaps it was simple exhaustion, or perhaps it was the knowledge that for now, at least, they had a plan. We'll need to stop midday, Nathaniel said, breaking a long silence. Rest Samson and give Susan a chance to stretch. Grace nodded, then frowned as she felt unusual heat radiating from the infant against her chest. Concerned, she shifted the sling to better see Susan's face. The baby's cheeks were flushed, her breathing slightly more rapid than normal. Nathaniel, she said, her voice tight with sudden worry. We need to stop now. Susan's burning with fever. He reined in immediately, helping Grace dismount before sliding down himself. Under the shade of a massive oak, Grace laid Susan on Nathaniel's spread bedroll, her practiced hands gentle as she unwrapped the swaddling clothes. Susan whimpered, her usual lively movements subdued by illness. How bad is it? Nathaniel asked, crouching beside them. Grace placed her palm against Susan's forehead, then her cheek. Too hot. And her pulses racing. She looked up at him, fear evident in her eyes. She needs willow bark for the fever, and I'll need to make a poultice to draw the heat from her body. My supplies were lost in the fire, he finished grimly. What do you need? Grace scanned their surroundings, her mind cataloging possibilities. Willow grows near water. And I'll need yarrow if we can find it. The white flowering tops elderflower would help too. Nathaniel's expression turned skeptical. You aim to treat her with weeds? I aim to treat her with medicines that God placed in nature for our use, Grace replied sharply. The same medicines that kept your grandparents alive before fancy doctors came along with their powders and tinctures. He held up his hands in a placating gesture. No offense meant. It's just, my pa always warned us against eating wild plants, said most were poison. To the uninformed, they can be, Grace conceded, but to those who know their properties, they're healing gifts. She touched Susan's flushed cheek again, anxiety creasing her brow. I need to find those plants now, before her fever climbs higher. I'm coming with you, Nathaniel said firmly. Montgomery's men could still be searching these woods. Grace wanted to argue. She'd spent countless hours gathering herbs alone, but the reminder of the danger sobered her. Susan needs to stay cool. We should lay her in the shade with a dampened cloth. Working together, they made Susan as comfortable as possible, using water from Nathaniel's canteen to wet a scrap of clean cloth for her forehead. The baby's eyes fluttered open briefly, unfocused and glassy with fever, before closing again in restless sleep. She'll be all right for a few minutes, Grace said, though it cost her to leave the infant's side. The willow will be our best chance of bringing down her fever quickly. They followed a faint deer trail toward the sound of running water, Nathaniel leading the way, his hand never far from his holstered revolver. The stream, when they reached it, rushed clear and cold over rocks still slick from the night's rain. Grace scanned the banks intently. There, she said after a moment, pointing to a stand of slender trees with narrow leaves. Willow. We need the inner bark from the younger branches." She waded into the ankle-deep water without hesitation, her skirts gathered in one hand. Nathaniel followed, withdrawing his hunting knife and offering it to her hilt first. "This should work better than whatever you were planning to use," he said. Grace accepted the knife with a nod of thanks. "Hold this branch steady," she instructed, selecting a limb about as thick as her thumb. Together, they harvested several strips of the pale inner bark, Grace explaining as they worked. "The willow contains a substance that fights fever and eases pain. Indians have used it for generations, and now even some city doctors prescribe it in a refined form." "My mother used to make us chew willow bark when we had the toothache," Nathaniel admitted. "It tasted foul as sin, but it did seem to help." They continued their search along the stream bank, with Grace pointing out other useful plants. The delicate white flowers of yarrow growing in sunny patches, the broad leaves of plantain that could soothe burns and insect bites. "How did you learn all this?" Nathaniel asked as they gathered yarrow blossoms. Grace's hands moved deftly among the plants, selecting only what they needed. "My mother taught me the basic remedies that every frontier woman should know. Then, when I became Dr. Burnett's assistant, he encouraged me to study further. He believes that traditional knowledge and modern medicine can complement each other." "You speak of him with great respect." "Me and his wife took me in after my parents died," Grace explained. "Gave me a home, an education, and a purpose." She straightened, her apron pockets now filled with their gathered remedies. "We should get back to Susan." They found the baby as they'd left her, still flushed with fever but resting quietly beneath the damp cloth. Grace immediately set to work, crushing willow bark between two smooth stones and steeping it in hot water from the small pot Nathaniel carried in his saddlebags. As she worked, she explained each step to Nathaniel, who watched with an intensity that suggested he was committing every detail to memory. "The willow tea needs to be cool enough for Susan to take, but still warm enough to draw out the medicine. The yarrow poultice will help draw the heat from her skin." "Will it be enough?" he asked, his voice uncharacteristically uncertain. Grace looked up, surprised by the vulnerability in his tone. "You sound like the fathers I attend at difficult births, strong men suddenly faced with something they can't control with physical strength or courage." A muscle worked in Nathaniel's jaw as he knelt beside Susan, adjusting the damp cloth on her forehead with surprising gentleness. "It's different when it's a child," he said finally, "especially one this small, so helpless." "Children are remarkably resilient," Grace assured him. "More than we give them credit for." She administered the willow tea a few drops at a time using a clean cloth twisted to form a wick. Susan made faces at the bitter taste, but took enough to satisfy Grace. The yarrow poultice, wrapped in a thin piece of linen, was laid across the baby's chest and abdomen. "Now we wait," Grace said, settling back against the trunk of the oak. "And pray." The afternoon stretched long as they kept vigil over Susan. Nathaniel maintained a watchful eye on their surroundings, occasionally circling their small camp to ensure they remained alone in the wilderness. Each time he returned, his first glance was for Susan, checking her progress with an intensity that spoke volumes about his growing attachment to the child. As the sun began its westward descent, Susan's fever finally broke. Her skin, burning hot for hours, now felt merely warm to Grace's touch, and her breathing had eased into the deep, regular pattern of healthy sleep. "The fever's broken," Grace announced, relief evident in her voice. "She'll sleep deeply now as her body recovers." Nathaniel's shoulders slumped slightly, the only outward indication of the tension he'd been carrying. "You've a gift," he said quietly. "I've seen army doctors with less skill or confidence." "It's knowledge, not magic," Grace replied, though she was pleased by the genuine respect in his tone. "Any woman with the proper training could do the same." "Perhaps," Nathaniel conceded. "But not every woman would have maintained such composure while fleeing for her life, losing her home, and tending to a sick infant." Darkness began to settle around them, and Nathaniel built a small fire, keeping the flames low to avoid drawing attention. They decided to make camp for the night rather than pushing on to Justice Mills. Susan needed rest, and truth be told, so did Grace. After a simple meal of jerky and hard biscuits from Nathaniel's provisions, Grace cradled Susan in her arms, rocking gently as she had each night since finding the baby on her porch. Without conscious thought, she began to sing softly, a lullaby her mother had sung to her, its melody sweet and slightly melancholy in the gathering dusk. Across the small fire, Nathaniel sat cleaning his revolver, his hands moving with the automatic precision of long habit. But Grace noticed that his movements had slowed, his attention caught by her quiet singing. In the flickering firelight, his features seemed softer somehow. The hard lines of his face relaxed as he watched her with the child. When she finished the song, Susan was deeply asleep, her breathing slow and even. Grace continued to rock, reluctant to lay the baby down just yet. "You would have made a fine mother," Nathaniel said suddenly, his voice low in the darkness. "It seems a waste that you've spent your years delivering other women's children instead of having your own." In another context, from another man, the words might have stung. But Grace heard no judgment in his tone, only a genuine puzzlement that a woman with her obvious affinity for children remained unmarried. "God's plans don't always match our own," she replied simply. "I've delivered hundreds of babies into loving arms. There's a purpose in that, even if it's not the one I once imagined for myself." Nathaniel nodded slowly, his eyes reflecting the dancing flames. "I understand that more than you might think. When I first pinned on this badge, I believed I'd serve a few years, then find a piece of land, raise horses, maybe start a family." His mouth quirked in a humorless smile. 12 years later, I've seen too much, done too much. Some paths, once taken, don't easily circle back." The quiet confession, offered without self-pity or regret, touched something in Grace. For the first time, she saw beyond the hard-edged lawman to the man beneath, someone who had also set aside personal dreams in service to a larger purpose. "Yet here we are," she said softly, "about to marry and become guardians to a child neither of us expected. Perhaps some paths do circle back, just not in the ways we anticipate." Nathaniel's gaze met hers across the fire, something unreadable flickering in their depths. For a moment, neither spoke, the silence between them charged with unspoken possibilities. Then, Susan stirred in Grace's arms, breaking the moment. Nathaniel rose, spreading his bedroll near the fire. "You should sleep," he said, his voice returned to its usual practical tone. "We'll reach Justice Mills by midday tomorrow if we leave at first light." Grace nodded, arranging her own makeshift bed with Susan nestled safely beside her, yet as she drifted toward sleep, the memory of Nathaniel's expression as he watched her sing to Susan lingered in her mind. She had glimpsed something rare and unguarded in those gray eyes, a longing that mirrored her own, a wonder at the unexpected turns life could take. Nathaniel took the first watch, his back against an oak tree, rifle across his knees. The night settled around them, crickets chirping in the underbrush and stars appearing one by one in the darkening sky. Susan slept peacefully, her illness already becoming a memory. For the first time in years, Nathaniel found himself considering possibilities beyond the next mission, the next pursuit. In the soft glow of firelight, with Grace and Susan sleeping nearby, the solitary path he had followed for so long suddenly seemed less certain, less inevitable. It was only a necessary arrangement, he reminded himself firmly, a temporary solution to protect a child. Nothing more. Yet, as an owl called from the darkness and the fire burned low, Nathaniel Hayes faced an uncomfortable truth. Something had shifted within him these past few days, something he wasn't entirely prepared to examine or name. Whether it was the fierce protectiveness Grace showed towards Susan, or the skill and composure she demonstrated under pressure, or simply the unexpected picture they made together, woman, child, and man, he couldn't say. He only knew that for the first time in longer than he cared to remember, the badge on his chest and the solitary trail ahead no longer seemed sufficient. And that realization, more than Montgomery's men or the challenges that awaited them, unsettled him deeply. Chapter 4. Vows and Vulnerabilities. Justice Mills announced itself with little fanfare. A weathered sign swinging from a post at the edge of town, its painted letters faded by sun and rain. The settlement was larger than Cottonwood Springs, boasting a proper hotel, a bank, and several stores whose false fronts stretched optimistically toward the cloudless April sky. They arrived just after midday, Samson's hooves stirring up dust from the wide main street. Grace sat stiffly in front of Nathaniel, Susan sleeping peacefully in the sling against her chest. After 3 days on the trail, Grace was acutely aware of her disheveled appearance. Her travel-stained dress, her hair hastily pinned beneath her bonnet, the layer of dust that seemed to have worked its way into every fold of fabric. "The Frontier Hotel," Nathaniel said, nodding toward a 2-story clapboard building with freshly painted green shutters. "Best place in town. Judge Wilson's wife runs it when he's holding court elsewhere." Grace's stomach tightened with nerves. "Will he be here today?" "Should be. Court's not in session till next week." Nathaniel guided Samson to the hitching post outside the hotel. "If not, we'll send word. He doesn't live far." He dismounted first, then reached up to help Grace down, his hands strong and steady at her waist. The brief contact sent an unexpected flutter through her midsection, which she attributed firmly to nerves. The hotel lobby smelled of beeswax polish and fresh-baked bread, a welcome change from campfire smoke and pine resin. A small, round woman with silver-streaked dark hair looked up from the ledger at the front desk, her face brightening in recognition. "Nathaniel Hayes!" she exclaimed, hurrying around the desk. "What brings the Rangers to our quiet corner of Texas?" "Mrs. Wilson." Nathaniel touched the brim of his hat respectfully. "I'm here on personal business, actually. Is the judge available?" Her bright eyes took in Grace and the baby, understanding dawning in her expression. Oh my, yes, he's here, taking his afternoon coffee in the parlor." She wiped her hands on her apron, suddenly all business. "But first things first, this poor young woman looks done in. And a baby, traveling in such conditions." Before either of them could respond, Mrs. Wilson had ushered them upstairs to a corner room overlooking the main street. The space was modestly furnished, but spotlessly clean. A brass bed with a colorful quilt, a washstand with a porcelain basin, a small writing desk beneath the window. "Running water right down the hall," Mrs. Wilson announced proudly. "Hot water can be brought up if you like, and I'll arrange for a proper bath for the lady." "Thank you. That's very kind," Grace managed, overwhelmed by the whirlwind of hospitality after days of rough camping. "I'll speak to the judge," Nathaniel said, setting down their meager belongings, "and see about getting some supplies." Mrs. Wilson's eyes twinkled. "Supplies for what, may I ask?" Nathaniel cleared his throat. "For a wedding, ma'am. If the judge is willing." "A wedding?" The older woman clasped her hands together in delight. "Today? Oh, but we must prepare properly. The young lady can't be married in travel clothes." "Really, that's not necessary," Grace began. "Nonsense." Mrs. Wilson was already halfway to the door. "I'll send up hot water right away, and I believe I have a dress that might suit. My niece left it behind last summer, a lovely blue that would complement your coloring beautifully." The door closed behind her with a decisive click, leaving Grace staring after her in stunned silence. "She's always been." "Enthusiastic," Nathaniel offered, a hint of amusement in his voice. Grace sank onto the edge of the bed, suddenly aware of how bone-weary she truly was. "This is happening rather fast." Nathaniel's expression sobered. "We can wait a day if you need time to rest." Grace glanced down at Susan, still miraculously sleeping despite the commotion. "No, the sooner we establish our cover, the safer we'll be." She met his gaze squarely. "But I meant what I said before. This arrangement is a necessary precaution only," he finished. "I'll secure separate lodgings after the ceremony if you prefer." Before Grace could respond, a knock at the door announced the arrival of hot water. What followed was a flurry of activity that left Grace's head spinning. 2 young maids brought up a copper hip bath and filled it with steaming water. Mrs. Wilson returned with not only the promised blue dress, but also a selection of feminine necessities. A clean chemise, hairpins, even a pot of lightly scented lotion to soothe skin chapped by the trail. Nathaniel tactfully excused himself, taking Susan with him after Grace showed him how to hold her properly. "The judge and I have matters to discuss," he explained. Will an hour be sufficient? It was strange to watch him walk away with Susan, and Grace felt an unexpected pang of separation. She reminded herself that soon they would be legally bound as the child's guardians. That was the whole purpose of this charade, after all. Left alone with Mrs. Wilson, Grace surrendered to the older woman's ministrations. The bath was heavenly, washing away days of trail dust and easing muscles sore from riding. Mrs. Wilson chattered as she helped Grace wash her long auburn hair, sharing tales of Justice Mills and its inhabitants. Judge Wilson and I have been married 32 years, she confided as she combed out Grace's damp hair, and I can tell you, the secret is never going to bed angry. Speak your mind, clear the air. Then let peace return before you sleep. Grace stared at her reflection in the small mirror above the washstand. Mrs. Wilson, I should explain. Call me Martha, dear. We're going to be friends, I can tell. She began pinning Grace's hair into a simple but elegant arrangement. Now, I know shotgun weddings aren't ideal, but that handsome ranger of yours has honor written all over him. And the way he looks at that baby. Already a devoted father, I'd wager. Grace felt heat rise in her cheeks. It's not what you think. Martha Wilson paused, hairpin held aloft. What I think, my dear, is that life on the frontier forces practical decisions. Whether it's love or necessity bringing you two together, the important thing is the welfare of that sweet child. She smiled knowingly. The rest often follows in its own time. The blue dress fit remarkably well, needing only minor adjustments to accommodate Grace's slightly taller frame. The color was deeper than cornflower but lighter than indigo, setting off her auburn hair and making her eyes appear more green than hazel. There, Martha declared, stepping back to admire her handiwork, every inch a bride. Gazing at her reflection, Grace hardly recognized herself. The woman in the mirror looked composed, even beautiful, a far cry from the trail-worn midwife who had arrived on horseback hours before. A soft knock at the door heralded Nathaniel's return. When Martha opened it, Grace was startled by the transformation in his appearance as well. He had bathed and shaved, his dark hair still damp at the temples. He wore clean clothes, not fancy but respectable, and had even found a vest to cover his usual trail-worn shirt. He held Susan, now awake and freshly dressed in what appeared to be a christening gown far too large for her tiny frame. Where did you find that? Grace asked, gesturing to Susan's outfit. Judge Wilson's youngest grandchild, Nathaniel explained. His daughter insisted we borrow it. Their eyes met across the room, and something shifted in Nathaniel's expression as he took in Grace's appearance. For a brief moment, the practiced neutrality he typically maintained gave way to genuine appreciation, quickly masked. You look, he began, then seemed to reconsider whatever he had been about to say. Ready? Judge Wilson had agreed to perform the ceremony in the hotel's small parlor. Though Grace had expected a perfunctory exchange of vows, Martha Wilson had transformed the space with touches that made her heart ache with their thoughtfulness. A vase of wildflowers on the mantel, a small cake on a side table, even a length of white ribbon to wrap around their joined hands. It's the Celtic tradition, Martha explained, arranging the ribbon, to bind your lives together. The judge himself was a tall, spare man, with kind eyes that seemed to see more than his quiet demeanor suggested. He greeted Grace warmly, then exchanged meaningful glances with Nathaniel. Ranger Hayes has explained your situation, he said to Grace, his voice low enough that only she could hear. Rest assured, the paperwork will be filed properly, but with the discretion your circumstances require. Relief washed through her. At least they wouldn't need to elaborate on their fictional romance. The ceremony itself was brief but surprisingly moving. Judge Wilson spoke of commitment and honor, of the sacred duty of parents to protect and nurture their children. As Nathaniel repeated his vows, his deep voice steady and sure, Grace found herself studying the planes of his face, wondering about the man beneath the ranger's stoic exterior. When her turn came, Grace spoke the ancient promises with quiet dignity, aware of the irony in pledging fidelity and devotion to a man she had known less than a week. Yet there was comfort in the ritual, in the familiar words that had bound couples together through centuries of uncertainty and hardship. The ring? Judge Wilson prompted. Grace started. They hadn't discussed rings, hadn't thought that far ahead in their hasty planning. But Nathaniel reached into his pocket and withdrew a simple gold band, worn but well polished. "It was my mother's," he said quietly, "if that's acceptable." Stunned, Grace could only nod as he slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit as though made for her, the gold warm against her skin. "By the authority vested in me by the state of Texas, I now pronounce you husband and wife." Judge Wilson smiled benevolently. "You may kiss your bride, Ranger." Another detail they hadn't discussed. Grace felt heat rise in her cheeks as Nathaniel hesitated, clearly caught off guard. Then, with a barely perceptible nod, he leaned forward and pressed his lips gently to her cheek, his hand light at her waist. The kiss was brief and chaste, yet Grace felt its impression linger as they turned to accept the congratulations of the judge and his wife. Martha's knowing smile suggested she had drawn her own conclusions about their restrained display of affection. "Now," the older woman declared, "we must celebrate properly. I've had cook prepare a special dinner in the hotel restaurant." The hotel's dining room was surprisingly elegant for a frontier establishment, with white tablecloths and polished silverware. Several other guests were already dining when their small party entered. Susan, overtired from the day's excitement, had finally surrendered to sleep in a makeshift cradle fashioned from a drawer in the Wilsons' private quarters. Grace felt oddly unmoored as she took her seat beside Nathaniel, her husband, according to the certificate now signed and sealed in Judge Wilson's possession. The gold band on her finger caught the lamplight, a tangible reminder of the commitment they had made, however pragmatic its origins. "A toast," Judge Wilson proposed, raising his glass, "to Mr. and Mrs. Hayes and their new beginning." The wine was sweet and heady after days of nothing but stream water and coffee. Grace sipped carefully, aware of Nathaniel's solid presence beside her, the occasional brush of his arm against hers, sending inexplicable shivers across her skin. They had nearly finished their meal when a portly gentleman in an expensive suit approached their table, his round face flushed with excitement. "I beg your pardon for the intrusion," he said, his gaze fixed on Nathaniel. "But aren't you and J.C. Hayes, the author?" Nathaniel's fork paused halfway to his mouth. "I'm afraid you're "It is you!" the man exclaimed, not waiting for Nathaniel to finish. "I'd recognize you anywhere from the photograph in your books. Porter Williams, sir, manager of the First Bank of Justice Mills." He thrust out his hand, which Nathaniel shook automatically. "Your adventures have provided me countless hours of enjoyment." Grace watched in bewilderment as confusion flickered across Nathaniel's face. Before he could correct the banker, Williams turned to the room at large. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have a celebrity in our midst, N.G. Hayes himself, author of the most thrilling Western adventures in print today." A murmur of interest rippled through the dining room. Several patrons craned their necks to get a better look at their table. "Mr. Williams," Nathaniel began, his voice tight. "There's been a So modest," Williams clapped him on the shoulder. "Tell me, sir, is it true that your latest novel features a ranger pursuing outlaws into Comanche territory? I've only just begun it, but I can hardly put it down." Grace suddenly realized what was happening. The novelist, whose books lined Dr. Burnett's shelves, whose adventures she had devoured during long winter evenings when patients were few and the snow piled high outside the cabin windows. She stared at Nathaniel in astonishment. He couldn't be. Surely she would have made the connection if her trail companion was actually her favorite author, but the coincidence of the name? "My husband is very modest about his work," she heard herself saying, a mischievous impulse overtaking her good sense. "In fact, he rarely discusses his books in public." Nathaniel's head whipped toward her, his expression a fascinating mixture of disbelief and betrayal. "Mrs. Hayes," Williams exclaimed, clearly delighted to find an ally. "Then you must know all about his famous character Jack Sloan, the most realistic portrayal of a Texas Ranger in literature today, or so the critics claim." "Oh, yes," Grace replied, warming to her role. "I'm particularly fond of the scene in Red River Crossing where Jack faces down those rustlers using nothing but his wits and a broken pistol." Nathaniel's eyes widened fractionally as understanding dawned. They were trapped in their charade, unable to correct the banker without potentially drawing unwanted attention to their true identities. "Perhaps Mr. Hayes would sign my copy?" Williams asked hopefully. "I have the latest right upstairs in my room." "My husband never travels with a pen," Grace improvised quickly. Bad luck for a writer, he says, separates work from life. How fascinating. Williams pulled up a chair without invitation. Tell me, Mr. Hayes, do you base your characters on real people? That villain in your third book, Blackwell, wasn't it? Seemed so authentic in his depravity. I draw from observations, Nathaniel said carefully, shooting Grace a look that promised retribution. In my travels, and such travels they must be, the detail you include about Apache customs in Desert Vengeance was remarkable. Have you spent much time among the tribes? Grace bit her lip to suppress a smile as Nathaniel cleared his throat, clearly searching for an appropriate response. I prefer to maintain some mystery about my methods, he said finally. Keeps readers guessing. Of course, Williams nodded enthusiastically. A writer must protect his craft. But surely you can tell us something about your next book? My wife is desperate to know if Emily will finally accept Jack's proposal after he rescued her from those Comancheros. Grace nearly choked on her wine. She had been wondering the same thing since finishing the last novel, where the spirited schoolteacher and the hardened ranger had parted ways after a heated argument about his dangerous profession. I never discuss works in progress, Nathaniel said firmly. Tempts fate. Wise, very wise, Williams agreed. But perhaps you might share how you develop such compelling female characters. My Lucinda says she's never read a man who understands a woman's heart quite like you do. Nathaniel's composure finally cracked. He glanced at Grace, a silent plea for rescue in his gray eyes. My husband finds inspiration in real women, Grace interjected smoothly. Their courage, their complexities. She placed her hand over Nathaniel's on the table, feeling the slight tension in his fingers. But tonight is actually a special occasion for us. We were just married this afternoon. A wedding? Williams exclaimed. How wonderful. And the child I saw earlier, yours? Yes, Nathaniel said firmly, seemingly grateful for a topic he could address with confidence. Our daughter, Susan. Congratulations to you both. This calls for a celebration. Allow me to send over a bottle of my finest whiskey. Williams rose, pumping Nathaniel's hand enthusiastically. And please, Mr. Hayes, consider giving a reading during your stay. The Literary Society would be beside themselves with excitement. As Williams bustled away to arrange for the promised whiskey, Nathaniel leaned close to Grace's ear. I hope you're enjoying yourself, he murmured, though a reluctant amusement softened his words. Immensely, she whispered back, though I'm devastated to learn that my favorite author is a fraud. I've never claimed to be a writer, he protested quietly. No, but you're making a fair attempt at it now, she smiled innocently. Tell me, Mr. Hayes, will Emily and Jack reconcile in the next book? I've been dying to know. A gleam appeared in Nathaniel's eyes, a spark of humor she hadn't witnessed before. Perhaps, he replied, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial rumble, if the lady can overlook the gentleman's stubborn nature and dangerous profession. And if the gentleman can admit that he needs more in his life than a badge and a gun, Grace countered, surprised by her own boldness. Something shifted in Nathaniel's expression, a momentary vulnerability quickly masked. Some men aren't meant for hearth and home, Mrs. Hayes. The newly acquired surname sent an odd flutter through Grace's stomach. Before she could respond, Williams returned with not only whiskey but 3 other prominent citizens eager to meet the famous author in their midst. For the next hour, Grace watched in fascination as Nathaniel navigated increasingly specific questions about books he had never written and characters he had never created. His responses grew more creative and confident as the evening progressed, drawing on what details Grace managed to subtly supply and weaving them into vague but satisfying answers. I always maintain that a character must find his own path, he told the town's schoolteacher, who had strong opinions about the educational methods described in one of the novels. Just as the author must sometimes let the story unfold in unexpected ways, by the time they finally extricated themselves from their admirers, pleading the need to check on their infant daughter, both were struggling to contain their laughter. I believe you actually enjoyed that, Grace accused as they climbed the stairs to their room. I enjoyed watching you trying not to correct my literary blunders, Nathaniel admitted. Your face when I suggested that Jack might abandon the Rangers to become a shopkeeper. He would never, Grace exclaimed, then caught herself. I mean, The character as established would find such a life stifling. Nathaniel chuckled, the sound rich and unexpected. I'll take your word for it, being as you're apparently the expert on my fictional creations. They reached the door to their room, and suddenly the easy camaraderie of moments before evaporated. The reality of their situation reasserted itself. A marriage of convenience, a shared room, boundaries that remained unclear despite the legal document binding them together. Nathaniel seemed to sense her sudden unease. I'll check on Susan, then find myself a chair for the night, he said quietly. Don't be ridiculous, Grace replied, practical despite her nervousness. The bed is plenty large enough for both of us, and you need proper rest as much as I do. She met his gaze steadily. I trust you, Nathaniel. You've given me no reason not to. Something like gratitude flickered in his eyes. Nevertheless, I'll stay on top of the covers. Propriety matters, especially in appearance. As they entered the room, Grace caught sight of her reflection in the small mirror. The blue dress, now slightly rumpled from hours of sitting, her mother's ring gleaming on her finger, her hair coming loose from its pins. The woman looking back at her was Grace Hayes now, at least according to the law and the residents of Justice Mills. She touched the gold band lightly, wondering what her parents would think of her unusual marriage, a union founded not on love or even affection, but on the pragmatic need to protect an innocent child. Yet as she watched Nathaniel gently check on the sleeping Susan, his large hand impossibly gentle as he adjusted her blanket, Grace couldn't help but feel that perhaps this strange arrangement contained more honor than many conventional marriages. She's sleeping soundly, Nathaniel reported, his voice hushed. No sign of the fever returning. Thank God for small mercies, Grace murmured. Their eyes met across the room, acknowledgement passing between them of how far they had come in such a short time, from strangers to allies to, now, husband and wife in the eyes of the law. Whatever tomorrow might bring, they faced it bound together by vows neither had expected to make, protecting a child neither had expected to love. And if Grace felt an unexpected warmth when Nathaniel's hand brushed hers as he passed, or if he found his gaze lingering on the curve of her neck as she unpinned her hair, well, such awareness was only natural between a man and woman forced into close quarters. Nothing more than that, surely. Nothing that would complicate the practical arrangement they had so carefully established. Or so they both told themselves as night settled over Justice Mills, and the newly minted Mr. and Mrs. Hayes prepared for their first night as husband and wife in name only. The lamplight cast long shadows across the hotel room as Grace emerged from behind the dressing screen, her borrowed nightgown a whisper of white cotton against her skin. The garment was modest enough, high-necked and long-sleeved, with a hem that brushed the tops of her feet, but she felt strangely vulnerable nonetheless. Perhaps it was the knowledge that for the first time in her adult life, she would be sharing a room with a man who was neither patient nor family. A man who was, according to the law and the citizens of Justice Mills, her husband. Nathaniel stood by the window, his broad shoulders silhouetted against the night-darkened glass. He had removed his vest and boots, but remained otherwise fully dressed, his gun belt draped over the back of a chair within easy reach. At the sound of her approach, he turned, his expression carefully neutral, despite the intimacy of their situation. I've made up a pallet here, he said, gesturing to a bedroll he'd arranged on the floor near the door. I'll be comfortable enough. Grace glanced at the narrow bed where Susan already slept, nestled among pillows to prevent her from rolling. You'll be as stiff as a board by morning, she said practically. The bed is large enough for both of us. A muscle twitched in Nathaniel's jaw. That wouldn't be proper. We're married, Grace pointed out, then felt heat rise in her cheeks at his sharp look. Legally speaking, I mean. And I trust you to behave as a gentleman. It's not a question of trust, Nathaniel replied, his voice low to avoid waking Susan. It's a matter of respect. The simple words warmed something inside Grace, easing a tension she hadn't fully acknowledged. In her years of tending to births and illnesses, she had encountered too many women whose husbands showed precious little respect for boundaries or wishes. Then I respect your decision, she said with a small smile. Though I still think you'll regret it when you try to mount your horse tomorrow. She settled onto the edge of the bed, beginning the nightly ritual of unbraiding and brushing her hair. The familiar motions soothed her, a reminder of normalcy in circumstances that were anything but normal. 100 strokes, her mother had always insisted, to keep the auburn waves healthy and shining. From his position near the window, Nathaniel watched the hypnotic movement of the brush through her hair, the copper strands capturing the lamplight like liquid fire. He'd seen women brushing their hair before, his mother, his sisters, but something about Grace's unself-conscious grace made it difficult to look away. "May I ask you something?" he said suddenly, breaking the comfortable silence that had settled between them. Grace paused mid-stroke, regarding him curiously. "Of course." "Why midwifery? It's not a calling many women would choose, especially a woman of your education and background." The question surprised her, not least because it revealed that Nathaniel had been forming his own assessments of her history and character. She resumed brushing, considering her answer. "I wasn't born to it, if that's what you're asking," she said finally. "My father was a schoolteacher before he brought us west. My mother taught me reading and figures before I was 6. A wistful smile touched her lips at the memory. They had such plans for me. Perhaps a teacher like my father, or even a governess for a wealthy family back east. What happened?" Nathaniel asked quietly, sensing the shadow behind her words. Grace's hand stilled again, the brush coming to rest in her lap. "Influenza," she said simply. "The winter of '58, half the town fell ill, including both my parents. I was 12 years old." Nathaniel's expression softened with understanding. "I'm sorry." "Dr. Burnett and his wife Martha took me in afterward," Grace continued, her voice steady despite the old grief that still lingered in her heart. "They had no children of their own, and I suppose I filled that void for them. The doctor began teaching me about herbs and healing almost immediately, first simple remedies, then more complex treatments. And the midwifery? That came later." Grace smiled at the memory. "I was 16 the first time Dr. Burnett took me to a birth. The mother was young, frightened. Something in me just knew what to do, what to say, to ease her fears. Afterward, the doctor said I had a gift." She began brushing her hair again, the rhythmic strokes punctuating her words. "There's something miraculous about bringing new life into the world, standing in that sacred space between one moment when a woman labors alone and the next when she becomes a mother, placing a new soul into waiting arms." Her voice softened. "It helps fill the emptiness, I suppose. The family I lost, the family I feared I'd never have." The confession hung in the air between them, more intimate than she had intended. Grace hurriedly finished brushing her hair, plaiting it into a loose braid for the night. "I've embarrassed you with my questions," Nathaniel said, regret evident in his tone. "No," Grace replied honestly. "It's been a long time since I've spoken of such things. Dr. Burnett and Martha already know my history, and in a small town like Cottonwood Springs, few ask questions about matters they think might cause pain." Nathaniel moved from the window to sit in the room's single chair, his forearms resting on his knees as he studied the worn floorboards. In the intimate quiet of the lamplit room, with Susan's soft breathing the only sound between them, something shifted in the careful distance he had maintained. "My father had a small ranch near San Antonio," he said, his deep voice hushed in the stillness. "Nothing grand. 100 acres, maybe 40 head of cattle, some decent quarter horses. But it was ours, free and clear. Land he'd worked for 15 years to buy, to build something that would last." Grace recognized the offering for what it was, reciprocation of her own vulnerability, a balancing of the scales between them. "What happened to it?" she asked gently. Nathaniel's face hardened, old pain etching lines around his mouth. "Men like Jeremiah Montgomery happened to it, not him specifically, but his kind. Wealthy ranchers who wanted more land, more water rights. When my father refused to sell, suddenly our cattle started disappearing. Fences were cut, our barn burned one night." He rubbed his palm absently against his thigh as if trying to erase an old stain. "Pa went to the law for help. The local sheriff promised to investigate, took statements, collected evidence." A bitter smile twisted his lips. 2 weeks later, my father was arrested for stealing cattle. The very cattle that had been taken from our land." "That's terrible." Grace said softly. It gets worse, Nathaniel continued, his gaze fixed on some distant point in his memory. While he was in jail awaiting trial, more men came to our ranch, said they had papers showing my father had defaulted on loans he'd never taken, that the bank now owned everything. They gave my mother and sisters 3 days to clear out. What did you do? What could I do? I was 17 with a mother and 3 younger sisters to protect. His hands clenched into fists. We packed what we could carry and went to my uncle's place near the Red River. My father died in that jail cell before his case ever went to trial. They called it heart failure. The quiet rage in his voice told Grace he believed differently, but she didn't press. I swore then that I would find a way to fight men like that, Nathaniel said, his voice steadying. Men who use power and money to twist the law to their purposes, who take what they want without regard for who gets hurt. He glanced up, meeting her gaze directly. 3 years later, I pinned on a ranger's badge. Been wearing it ever since. The pieces of Nathaniel Hayes began to fit together in Grace's mind. His dedication to finding Susan, his determination to protect her from Montgomery's brother. This wasn't just another assignment for him. It was personal in ways she hadn't fully understood until now. Have you ever told anyone this before? She asked. A faint smile touched Nathaniel's lips. Not for many years. Rangers don't much discuss their pasts. It's the job that matters, not how you came to it. Thank you for telling me, Grace said simply. He nodded once, acknowledging her words without requiring more said. Then he rose and checked the latch on the door, a habit born of years living with constant vigilance. We should get some rest, he said, practical once more. If Montgomery's men have tracked us this far, we'll need to move on quickly. Grace settled into the bed beside Susan, drawing the quilt up against the night's chill. Nathaniel extinguished the lamp before stretching out on his bedroll, only his shadowy outline visible in the faint moonlight filtering through the curtains. Good night, Mr. Hayes, Grace said softly, the newly acquired surname still strange on her tongue. Good night, Mrs. Hayes, came his quiet reply. The silence that followed was oddly comfortable, as if the exchange of confidences had eased some of the awkwardness between them. Yet, as Grace drifted towards sleep, her mind circled back to the ceremony earlier that day. The ancient words, the binding ribbon, the unexpected weight of Nathaniel's mother's ring on her finger. Words spoken for convenience, vows exchanged as a practical solution to a dangerous problem. Yet something about them had resonated, deeper than either had anticipated. In sharing pieces of their pasts, they had created a different kind of bond. One not sanctioned by law or church, but perhaps more meaningful for having been freely given. Between them, Susan sighed in her sleep, one tiny hand curled against her cheek. The child who had brought them together through extraordinary circumstances, who now depended on them both for protection and care. A small life bridging the space between 2 wounded souls who had long ago set aside dreams of family for different paths. In the quiet darkness, Grace found herself offering a silent prayer, not for safety or guidance this time, but in gratitude. For despite the danger that had driven them to this point, despite the uncertainty that still lay ahead, she felt strangely at peace, as if perhaps the unconventional family they had formed might be exactly where each of them was meant to be. Across the room, Nathaniel lay awake, listening to the soft, even breathing of Grace and Susan. The gold band that had once belonged to his mother now circled the finger of a woman he barely knew, yet had entrusted with his deepest secrets. The irony wasn't lost on him, that after years of solitary dedication to his badge, he now found himself legally bound to a family, however temporary the arrangement might be. And if something stirred in his heart at the thought of Grace's quiet strength or Susan's innocent trust, he attributed it to the strange intimacy of their circumstances. Nothing more than that. Nothing that would complicate the careful boundaries they had established. Yet, as sleep finally claimed him, Nathaniel's last waking thought was of Grace's hands gently tending to Susan and the peculiar sense of rightness he had felt watching them together. As if some piece of himself long forgotten had suddenly been remembered, awakened by the unexpected family that fate, or perhaps providence, had placed in his path. Chapter 5. The Author's Reading. Dawn painted the sky in watercolor hues of pink and gold as Grace finished packing their meager belongings. Susan, freshly fed and changed, gurgled contentedly on the bed, her tiny fists waving at nothing in particular. The infant had slept remarkably well for a child whose first weeks of life had been so tumultuous, as if she somehow understood the need for stealth and quiet. "We should reach Fort Worth in 4 days if the weather holds," Nathaniel said, securing their saddlebags. He had risen before first light, checking their planned route and arranging for provisions. The efficiency with which he approached even simple tasks spoke of years spent relying on his own careful planning for survival. Grace nodded, tucking a clean diaper into the bundle she'd prepared for Susan. "The sooner we're away from here, the better. I don't fancy another evening pretending to know about books I've never written." The hint of amusement in her voice drew a reluctant smile from Nathaniel. "You seem to enjoy my discomfort well enough." "Perhaps a little," she admitted, lifting Susan into her arms. "Though I'll miss Martha Wilson's kindness. It was nice to be fussed over, even briefly." A soft knock at the door silenced them both. Nathaniel moved instinctively between Grace and the entrance, his hand dropping to the revolver at his hip. "Mr. and Mrs. Hayes?" Martha Wilson's cheerful voice called. "Are you decent? I've brought breakfast, seeing as you're planning an early departure." Nathaniel relaxed minutely, crossing to open the door. Martha bustled in carrying a tray laden with coffee, fresh biscuits, preserves, and slices of ham, still steaming from the kitchen. "Can't have you starting your journey on empty stomachs," she declared, setting the tray on the small table. Her gaze softened as it fell on Susan. "And how is the little angel this morning, may I?" She held out her arms hopefully. Grace surrendered the baby with a smile, recognizing the older woman's genuine affection. "She slept through the night, if you can believe it." "A blessing indeed," Martha agreed, cradling Susan with practiced ease. "Judge Wilson and I raised 5 of our own. The quiet ones are rare treasures." She glanced around at their packed belongings. "You're truly determined to leave today? The weather report suggests rain by afternoon." "We need to reach Fort Worth as soon as possible," Nathaniel explained, helping himself to coffee. "Family matters waiting there." "Well, that's just the thing," Martha said, bouncing Susan gently as the baby cooed. "There's been a change of plans, I'm afraid." Grace paused in the act of spreading preserves on a biscuit. "What sort of change?" "Porter Williams and the town committee have arranged a special event for this evening. A reading by the famous author N.J. Hayes." Martha beamed, clearly pleased with the news. "The entire town is talking of nothing else. They've even sent riders to the outlying farms to spread the word." Nathaniel nearly choked on his coffee. "Mrs. Wilson, that's very kind, but as I explained to Mr. Williams, I don't do public readings. Normally, perhaps," Martha agreed cheerfully. "But this is a special occasion. Judge Wilson has already approved the use of the courthouse, and Mrs. Peterson from the Ladies' Literary Society is arranging refreshments." Her expression grew earnest. "It would mean so much to everyone, Mr. Hayes. We so rarely have cultural events in Justice Mills." Grace watched the dismay spread across Nathaniel's face and felt a twinge of sympathy despite her amusement. The charade they'd begun the previous evening had clearly spiraled beyond their control. "Surely one more day won't make a difference," she suggested, catching Nathaniel's eye meaningfully. "And it would be ungracious to disappoint the townsfolk after they've gone to such trouble." She could almost see him calculating the risks, weighing the danger of delay against the suspicion they might arouse by refusing. A muscle twitched in his jaw, but when he spoke, his voice was even. "Of course, we'd be honored to participate." He managed a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Though I must warn you, I'm not much for public speaking." "Nonsense!" Martha exclaimed. "A man who writes such vivid adventures must have a natural gift for storytelling. The committee will expect you at the courthouse by 7 o'clock. She transferred Susan back to Grace's arms with visible reluctance. "Now, I'll leave you to your breakfast. So much to prepare." The door had barely closed behind her when Nathaniel turned to Grace, his expression a fascinating mixture of accusation and alarm. "This is your doing," he said, keeping his voice low. "You encouraged this charade." "I only played along with your mistaken identity," Grace protested, though a smile tugged at her lips. "How was I to know the entire town would organize a literary event overnight? What am I supposed to read?" Nathaniel demanded, raking a hand through his dark hair. I wouldn't know Nancy Hayes's writing if it was posted on every tree from here to the Red River. Grace settled Susan in the crook of her arm and returned to her breakfast, considering the dilemma. You'll need to learn enough about his books to be convincing, she said finally. Fortunately, you have a wife who happens to be quite familiar with his work. A stroke of luck indeed, Nathaniel replied dryly. He paced the small room like a caged mountain lion. If Montgomery's men pick up our trail while we're playing at literary salons, they're looking for a single woman with an infant, Grace pointed out. Not a respectable married couple attending a town function. She took a sip of coffee, warming to their plan. Besides, you said yourself we need a convincing cover. What could be more perfect than an author and his family passing through on their way to Fort Worth? Nathaniel's scowl suggested he found several flaws in her reasoning, but he couldn't argue with the logic. Fine, he conceded finally, but tomorrow we leave at first light, come hell or high water. Agreed. Grace wrapped a biscuit in a napkin and tucked it into her pocket for later. Now, let's make you an author. The day passed in a flurry of activity that left them little time to dwell on the risks of their extended stay. Nathaniel spent most of the morning sequestered with Grace in their room, frantically taking notes as she outlined the plots of N.J. Hayes's 5 published novels, describing key characters and memorable scenes. Jack Sloane isn't just any ranger, Grace explained, bouncing Susan on her knee as she spoke. He's principled to a fault, haunted by a mistake in his past that cost an innocent man his life. That's why he's so driven to see justice done, even when it puts him at odds with his superiors. Sounds like a difficult man to live with, Nathaniel observed, scribbling notes in a small leather-bound book he'd purchased from the hotel desk. That's exactly what Emily Bradford tells him in Desert Vengeance when he abandons their dinner plans to chase a cattle rustler. Grace agreed. The romance is complicated by his dedication to the badge. A faint smile touched Nathaniel's lips. Imagine that. By midday, they ventured out into the town, ostensibly to purchase supplies for their journey, but truly to give Nathaniel a chance to practice his new persona in less demanding company than would gather that evening. Susan, nestled in a sling across Grace's chest, proved an unexpected asset to their cover. She has your eyes, Mr. Hayes, declared the milliner when they stopped to purchase a new bonnet for Grace, her old one having been lost in the flight from her cabin. Takes after her mother in all the ways that matter, Nathaniel replied smoothly, his hand coming to rest at the small of Grace's back in a gesture that seemed both protective and possessive. The casual touch sent an unexpected warmth through her, a reminder of how easily they had slipped into the roles of husband and wife. At the general store, they separated briefly, Nathaniel to select provisions, Grace to browse ready-made baby clothes that would better fit Susan than the borrowed gown from the Wilsons' grandchild. She was examining a delicate white dress when her attention was caught by a wall near the counter where several notices and wanted posters were tacked. Shifting Susan to her other arm, Grace moved closer, her gaze scanning the various announcements. A reward for information on cattle rustlers, an advertisement for a mail-order bride, notices of land for sale, and then, near the bottom corner, a poster that made her blood run cold. Wanted for theft and abandonment, Catherine Montgomery, last seen vicinity of El Paso, reward offered. The crude sketch beneath the words showed a young woman with fine features, her hair pulled back in a style similar to Grace's own. But it was the eyes that arrested her, wide-set and intelligent, with a hint of wariness that the artist had managed to capture, despite the rough medium. Eyes that stared out from the page with an expression Grace recognized from her own mirror on days when the world seemed particularly harsh. "Looks a bit like you, don't it?" Grace started at the voice beside her. The shopkeeper, a rail-thin man with spectacles perched on the end of his nose, nodded toward the poster. "Saw it when the ranger put it up few days ago. Thought then it had a look of you, though your hair's a shade lighter." "A ranger posted this?" Grace asked, fighting to keep her voice casual. "Passed through heading west," the shopkeeper confirmed. "Said she stole valuables from her dying husband, then disappeared with a child that wasn't rightly hers." Grace's arms tightened instinctively around Susan. How terrible, she managed, her mind racing with implications. The resemblance between herself and Catherine Montgomery, while not striking, was enough that someone looking for a woman with a newborn might easily mistake one for the other, especially in a small town like Cottonwood Springs. She felt Nathaniel's presence before she saw him, the familiar scent of leather and clean linen announcing his return. His stride faltered almost imperceptibly when he saw what had captured her attention. "Found everything you need, darling?" he asked, his voice carefully modulated despite the tension evident in the set of his shoulders. "Yes, I believe so," Grace replied, equally careful. "Though I think Susan is getting hungry. Perhaps we should return to the hotel." Nathaniel paid for their purchases with a nod to the shopkeeper, then guided Grace outside with a hand at her elbow. They walked in silence until they reached a small park at the center of town, where a wooden bench beneath a spreading oak offered relative privacy. "You knew," Grace said as soon as they were seated, her voice low but vibrant with suppressed emotion. "You knew Catherine Montgomery looked like me. That's why her baby was left on my doorstep. That's why Montgomery's men burned my home." Nathaniel didn't insult her intelligence by denying it. "I suspected as much when I saw you with Susan," he admitted. "The resemblance isn't strong, but to men looking for a woman with a newborn, it would be enough." "Why didn't you tell me?" Grace demanded, careful to keep her voice down despite her rising anger. "You let me believe it was mere chance that Susan was left with me, when all along you knew I was in danger simply because I look somewhat like her mother." "Would you have helped if I'd told you the full truth?" Nathaniel countered, his gray eyes serious as they met hers. "Would you have agreed to flee your home, to marry a stranger if you'd known that Montgomery's men might kill you on sight just for resembling Catherine?" The brutal honesty of the question silenced her momentary outrage. She looked down at Susan, now sleeping peacefully against her chest, unaware of the storm brewing around her tiny existence. "You should have trusted me with the truth," she said finally, her tone softer but no less firm. "I had a right to know the full extent of the danger." "You're right," Nathaniel conceded, surprising her with his frank admission. "I was wrong to withhold that information. I thought," he paused, searching for words, "I thought I was protecting you. But really I was protecting my mission, making sure you'd help me keep Susan safe." The confession, stripped of justification or excuse, eased some of the hurt that had flared within Grace. She understood the instinct to shield others from painful truths. Hadn't she done the same countless times at a birthing, assuring a struggling mother that everything was proceeding normally even when complications arose? "Is there anything else I should know?" she asked, meeting his gaze directly. Nathaniel hesitated, then shook his head. "Nothing. That changes our immediate situation. Susan needs protection, and Montgomery's men won't stop looking for her, or for anyone they believe might be her mother." Grace absorbed this, weighing it against what she already knew. The poster said Catherine stole from her husband. Montgomery's way of ensuring the law would be against her, too, Nathaniel explained. The only thing she took was her daughter and a locket with her own mother's picture. Hardly theft by any reasonable standard. A thought occurred to Grace suddenly. The real N.G. Hayes? Does he know someone is impersonating him? The abrupt change of subject seemed to catch Nathaniel off guard. "I doubt it," he said after a moment. "From what you've told me, he lives back east somewhere. And if he were to hear that an imposter was giving readings in his name, he'd likely be confused, perhaps annoyed." Nathaniel's brow furrowed. "Why do you ask?" Grace smiled thinly. "Because you're still not telling me everything, Ranger Hayes. You're worried about more than just Montgomery's men finding us. You're worried about other rangers discovering your deception." The flicker of surprise in his eyes confirmed her suspicion. "You're not just any ranger pursuing an outlaw's child," she continued, the pieces falling into place. "You've gone beyond your orders, haven't you? Perhaps even against them?" Nathaniel glanced around the park, ensuring they couldn't be overheard. "Catherine Montgomery's testimony was going to help us bring down more than just her husband," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "There are powerful men involved in his operations. Bankers, judges, even a state senator. Men who would prefer that Catherine's evidence die with her. The implications were staggering. And these men could pressure the Rangers to recall you?" "They already have," Nathaniel admitted. "My captain ordered me to return to Austin 3 days ago. When I didn't report in, He likely sent men to find me. Grace stared at him, truly seeing the risk he had taken for the first time. You could lose your badge over this. Something like grim humor flickered across his face. My badge is the least of what I could lose, Mrs. Hayes. He glanced meaningfully at Susan. But some promises matter more than orders. The magnitude of his commitment to a dying woman's request, to an orphaned child, to Grace herself through their hasty marriage, settled over her like a physical weight. Whatever his faults, whatever truths he had withheld, Nathaniel Hayes was a man of profound principle. Then we'd best make this evening's performance convincing, Grace said, her anger replaced by renewed determination. The longer we can maintain our cover as the literary Hayes family, the better chance we have of reaching Fort Worth undetected. Relief softened the hard planes of Nathaniel's face. You're still willing to continue even knowing the full risk? Grace looked down at Susan, tracing a gentle finger along the sleeping infant's cheek. Did you truly believe I would abandon her once I knew the truth? No, Nathaniel replied softly. No, I didn't. Their eyes met in shared understanding, the tension between them easing into something closer to the partnership they had originally agreed upon. Whatever secrets still lay between them, they were bound together now by more than just a legal document, bound by danger, by necessity, and by their growing devotion to the child who depended on them both. A church bell rang in the distance, marking the hour. Nathaniel rose, offering his hand to help Grace from the bench. We should head back. Apparently I have a reading to prepare for. Yes, you do, Grace agreed, accepting his assistance. As his fingers closed around hers, warm and strong, she found herself adding, And Nathaniel? No more secrets between us, not if we're to have any chance of keeping Susan safe. He nodded once, the gesture carrying the weight of a solemn vow. No more secrets. They walked back toward the hotel side by side, the picture of a contented young family enjoying an afternoon stroll. Only the careful way Nathaniel's gaze swept their surroundings and the tension Grace carried in her shoulders revealed the truth, that beneath their peaceful facade lay danger, deception, and a growing fear that their carefully constructed world might crumble at any moment. The weight of the wanted poster's revelation hung between them, unspoken but undeniable. For now, however, they had more immediate concerns. A room full of literary enthusiasts awaited the famous author N.G. Hayes, and neither Grace nor Nathaniel could afford for his performance to be anything less than completely convincing. The Justice Mills Courthouse had been transformed for the evening's literary event. Oil lamps cast a warm glow over the normally austere chamber, and someone had arranged wildflowers in mason jars along the judge's bench. Every available chair had been brought in from neighboring buildings, and still people stood 3 deep along the walls, their excited whispers creating a constant murmur that filled the room like the hum of honeybees. Grace sat in the front row beside Martha Wilson, Susan sleeping peacefully in her arms despite the crowd's eager anticipation. She could feel the curious glances directed their way, the famous author's wife and child, objects of fascination by association. Never seen the town so stirred up, Martha whispered, patting Grace's hand. Not even for the 4th of July celebration last year when Judge Wilson arranged for that brass band from San Antonio. Grace managed a smile, though her nerves were stretched taut as fiddle strings. Her discovery of the wanted poster had cast their precarious situation into stark relief, yet here they sat in the most public venue possible, about to draw even more attention to themselves. Nathaniel stood near the side entrance, engaged in conversation with Porter Williams and several other prominent citizens. To a casual observer, he appeared relaxed, even comfortable, his stance easy, his expression attentive. Only Grace noticed the tension in his shoulders, the way his gaze periodically swept the room with the practiced vigilance of a man accustomed to assessing threats. He had changed into the new shirt they'd purchased that afternoon, a crisp white cotton that emphasized the breadth of his shoulders and the sun-darkened tone of his skin. With his beard neatly trimmed and his dark hair combed back from his forehead, he looked every inch the successful author rather than the trail-worn ranger who had arrived in Justice Mills 2 days prior. Such a handsome couple you make, Martha sighed, following Grace's gaze. And he clearly adores you both. Before Grace could formulate a suitable response, Judge Wilson stepped up to the makeshift podium. He raised his hands for silence, and gradually the murmurs subsided. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his resonant voice filling the courthouse without apparent effort, "we are honored to welcome to Justice Mills one of the most celebrated authors of authentic Western adventures, a man whose vivid tales of frontier justice have captivated readers throughout our great nation. Please join me in welcoming Mr. N.G. Hayes." The applause was immediate and thunderous. Nathaniel made his way to the podium amid enthusiastic approval, shaking Judge Wilson's hand before turning to face the expectant audience. For a brief moment, Grace caught a flicker of something that might have been panic in his eyes as they met hers across the crowded room. Then his expression settled into one of modest confidence, and he cleared his throat. "Good evening," he began, his deep voice carrying easily to the farthest corners of the chamber. "I'm grateful for your warm welcome to Justice Mills." He paused, seeming to gather his thoughts. "I must confess I hadn't planned on giving a reading during my stay here. My wife and I are simply passing through on our way to Fort Worth with our daughter." A murmur of disappointment rippled through the crowd. "However," Nathaniel continued, "your enthusiasm has inspired me. Rather than reading from my published works, which many of you seem familiar with already," this drew appreciative chuckles from several audience members, "I thought I might share something new. A story still taking shape, you might say." Grace felt a flutter of apprehension. What was he planning? They had spent hours rehearsing details from the real N.J. Hayes' novels, preparing him to answer questions about fictional characters and plot points. An entirely new story hadn't been part of their strategy. "This tale begins, as many of mine do, with a journey," Nathaniel said, his voice dropping slightly, drawing the audience in. "But not the journey of a lawman or an outlaw this time. Instead, our story follows a young woman, a healer with gentle hands and a courageous heart." Grace stilled, her breath catching as she realized what he was doing. In a small settlement on the edge of the frontier, this woman had built a life of purpose, bringing new lives into the world and tending to the sick and injured. Though she had known her share of sorrow, having lost her family at a tender age, she carried on with quiet dignity, filling the emptiness inside her by easing the suffering of others. The courthouse had fallen utterly silent. Even the restless children who had been fidgeting in their seats were now watching Nathaniel with rapt attention. His words painted pictures in the air, conjuring a world his listeners could almost see and touch. Who once saved her? Hell, stormy night. After helping a farmer's wife deliver healthy twins, our healer returned home to find an unexpected gift on her doorstep. A newborn baby girl, wrapped in fine linen embroidered with symbols of a noble house. With the child was a simple note, "Please protect her." Martha Wilson gasped softly beside Grace. "Why, that's just like one of his novels," she whispered. "So exciting." Grace couldn't reply. Her throat had tightened with emotion as Nathaniel continued, weaving their experiences into a tale that was both true and falsified, revealing and concealing in equal measure. He described the healer's decision to care for the child, the growing bond between them, and the arrival of a mysterious stranger, a man sworn to uphold the law but haunted by his own past injustices. As the story unfolded, he touched on themes of duty, sacrifice, and the unexpected families formed in times of adversity. Nathaniel spoke without notes, his gaze occasionally meeting Grace's across the room as if drawing strength or inspiration from her presence. His natural cadence, the thoughtful pauses, the subtle shifts in tone, all suggested a man who had, indeed, spent years crafting narratives rather than tracking outlaws. "And so they fled together," he said, his voice warming with emotion that seemed to reach every listener. "The healer, the lawman, and the child. 3 souls brought together by circumstance, but bound by something stronger than mere chance. Something that might, in time, resemble a family." Grace blinked rapidly, surprised to find tears threatening. The fictional account of their situation had somehow captured emotional truths she had scarcely acknowledged to herself. The growing attachment to both Susan and Nathaniel, the sense that their hasty alliance was evolving into something neither had anticipated. I haven't yet discovered how their journey ends, Nathaniel admitted, a self-deprecating smile touching his lips. Characters have a way of taking paths their creator never intended, but I believe they will find their way to safety and perhaps to happiness if they trust in each other and in the providence that brought them together. He stepped back from the podium, seemingly surprised by the moment of profound silence that followed his words. Then applause erupted, more enthusiastic than before. Several women dabbed at their eyes with handkerchiefs, and even the most stoic-looking men nodded in appreciation. Judge Wilson returned to the podium, clapping Nathaniel on the shoulder. Ladies and gentlemen, I believe we've been privileged to hear the beginnings of Mr. Hayes's finest work yet, and now refreshments have been provided by the Ladies' Aid Society in the anteroom, where Mr. Hayes has graciously agreed to answer a few questions. As the crowd began to disperse, many pausing to shake Nathaniel's hand or offer congratulations, Grace remained seated, Susan still sleeping peacefully against her shoulder. She needed a moment to compose herself, to reconcile the man she had just witnessed with the taciturn ranger she had married out of necessity. "My dear," Martha said, her eyes bright with unshed tears, "your husband has a remarkable gift. To think that we might be immortalized in one of his stories. That healer could be any of a dozen women in these parts." Grace managed a smile. "Yes, he does have a way with words when the mood strikes him." The reception that followed was held in the courthouse's smaller chamber, where tables had been arranged with punch, coffee, and an assortment of cakes and cookies contributed by the town's finest bakers. Grace circulated through the crowd with Susan, accepting compliments on Nathaniel's behalf and deflecting questions about the real identities of the characters in his new story. Nathaniel himself was surrounded by admirers, handling their queries with increasing confidence. From across the room, Grace caught his eye, offering a small smile of encouragement. The flash of warmth in his returning glance sent an unexpected flutter through her chest. "Mrs. Hayes, isn't it?" The voice at her elbow startled her. Grace turned to find a lean man with sand-colored hair and cold eyes regarding her with an intensity that immediately set her nerves on edge. "Yes," she replied, instinctively drawing Susan closer. "And you are?" "James Collins," he answered with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Just passing through, like yourselves. Heard there was some excitement in town tonight." His gaze dropped to Susan, lingering a moment too long for comfort. "Beautiful child. How old?" "Just a few weeks," Grace said, fighting to keep her voice casual. "Seems mighty young for traveling such distances," he observed. "Fort Worth, I believe your husband mentioned. Any particular reason for choosing that destination?" The pointed nature of his questions raised alarm bells in Grace's mind. She glanced toward Nathaniel, hoping to catch his attention, only to find him already watching their exchange, his expression carefully neutral, even as his body angled toward them. "My husband has business there," she said vaguely, "publishing matters." "Is that so?" Collins's smile thinned slightly. "Curious. I heard talk of a woman and infant heading this direction not a week past. Woman who bore a striking resemblance to yourself, Mrs. Hayes." Grace's mouth went dry, but she forced herself to meet his gaze steadily. "The frontier seems full of young mothers these days, Mr. Collins. A blessing for our growing nation, wouldn't you say?" Before he could respond, Nathaniel appeared at her side, his hand coming to rest at the small of her back in a gesture both possessive and protective. "Darling, Susan looks tired," he said smoothly. "Perhaps we should retire for the evening?" He turned to Collins, extending his hand. "I don't believe we've met. Nathaniel Hayes?" "Kind of you to say." Nathaniel's smile was cordial, but Grace felt the tension in his body where it pressed against hers. "If you'll excuse us, our daughter needs her rest, and we have an early start tomorrow." "Of course." Collins stepped aside, but his gaze remained fixed on them. "Safe travels to Fort Worth. The roads can be treacherous these days. Never know who you might encounter." The veiled threat hung in the air as they made their farewells to the Wilsons and other prominent citizens. Nathaniel maintained an outward calm, thanking their hosts and apologizing for their early departure, but his hand never left Grace's waist, guiding her purposefully toward the door. They walked back to the hotel in silence, maintaining their facade of a contented family returning from a successful evening. Only when they had reached their room with the door firmly latched behind them did Nathaniel's composed expression give way to grim concern. "Pack only what we absolutely need," he said quietly, checking that the window was secured. We leave within the hour." "You recognized him," Grace said, gently laying Susan on the bed. It wasn't a question. "James Collins is Silas Montgomery's right hand," Nathaniel confirmed, retrieving his revolver from the bedside drawer. "If he's here, others won't be far behind." Grace moved efficiently, gathering their few possessions and securing them in their bags. "How did they find us so quickly?" "The wanted poster," Nathaniel replied, his voice tight with self-recrimination. "I should have anticipated they'd circulate Catherine's description. The shopkeeper mentioned a ranger had posted it, likely one of Montgomery's men in disguise or someone he bribed." Susan stirred and whimpered, perhaps sensing the tension in the room. Grace lifted her, murmuring soothing words while continuing to pack one-handed. "We'll need to avoid the main roads," Nathaniel said, checking the ammunition in his Winchester. "Travel by night when possible, at least until we're well away from Justice Mills." The gravity of their situation settled over Grace like a physical weight. The brief respite they'd found in Justice Mills, the sense of normalcy they'd experienced playing at being a family, all swept away by the appearance of one cold-eyed man. "Will Judge Wilson and Martha be in danger?" she asked suddenly, thinking of the kind couple who had welcomed them so warmly. Nathaniel paused in his preparations, his expression softening slightly at her concern. "Not likely. Montgomery's men want Susan, not innocent bystanders. Still, the sooner we're gone, the safer everyone will be." Within half an hour, they had packed their essential belongings and dressed in their warmest clothing. Nathaniel peered out the window, surveying the darkened street below. "The stable boy should have Samson ready by now," he said. "I slipped him extra to prepare the horse without raising questions." Grace nodded, securing Susan in her sling beneath a warm shawl. She glanced around the room one last time, her gaze lingering on the comfortable bed they would now exchange for hard ground and uncertain shelter. "Nathaniel," she said quietly as he shouldered their bags, "I understand now why you didn't tell me everything from the beginning. About Catherine's resemblance to me, about going against your orders." He turned to her, his expression guarded in the dim lamplight. "Do you?" "Yes." She met his gaze steadily. "You did what you thought necessary to protect Susan, just as I would have." Something in his face eased slightly at her words. "I should have trusted you with the truth. It won't happen again." Grace adjusted Susan's blanket, a question that had lingered in her mind finally finding voice. "Do you truly believe we'll find Catherine Montgomery alive?" Nathaniel's hesitation before answering told her more than his eventual words. "I believe in being thorough," he said carefully. "Until we have proof one way or the other, we have to consider the possibility." The careful neutrality of his response confirmed what Grace had already suspected, that he believed Catherine was dead but was unwilling to extinguish her hope entirely. The realization brought a curious mix of sadness and gratitude. Sadness for Susan, who might never know her birth mother, and gratitude for Nathaniel's gentle handling of a painful truth. "Either way," Grace said, "Susan has us now. Whatever happens, she won't face it alone." Nathaniel's gaze held hers for a long moment, something unreadable flickering in the gray depths. "No," he agreed softly. "She won't." He moved to the door, listening intently before easing it open. "The hallway's clear. We'll go down the back stairs, through the kitchen, less chance of being seen." Grace took a deep breath, squaring her shoulders as she prepared to step once more into uncertainty. The brief sanctuary they had found in Justice Mills already seemed like a distant memory, a momentary pause in the danger that pursued them. Yet as she followed Nathaniel's broad shoulders down the darkened hallway, Susan warm and trusting against her heart, Grace felt an unexpected sense of clarity. Their situation remained precarious, their future uncertain, but they faced it now with open eyes and honest hearts. No longer strangers thrust together by circumstance, but allies bound by shared purpose and growing trust. And perhaps, though neither was ready to acknowledge it, something deeper beginning to take root beneath the surface of their pragmatic alliance. Chapter 6: Return of the Sweetheart. Fort Worth sprawled along the Trinity River like a town caught between worlds. part frontier settlement with its dusty streets and wooden sidewalks, part emerging city with brick buildings and iron lampposts. The scent of livestock from the nearby stockyards mingled with the aroma of fresh bread from German bakeries. Cattle drives still passed through on their way north to Kansas, yet ladies in fashionable dresses could be seen shopping at mercantiles that advertised goods shipped directly from New York. It was, Nathaniel had explained, the perfect place to disappear while remaining within reach of civilization. 2 weeks after their midnight flight from Justice Mills, Grace stood at the window of a small whitewashed house on the eastern outskirts of town, watching morning sunlight filter through newly leafed cottonwoods. Susan lay on a quilt nearby, batting at a wooden rattle with increasingly coordinated movements. The house was modest. 2 rooms with a lean-to kitchen, a front porch just wide enough for a pair of rocking chairs, and a small stable out back. But after weeks of travel, interrupted by tense nights in roadside hotels where Nathaniel took turns keeping watch, it felt like a palace to Grace. "We'll stay at least a month," Nathaniel had told her when they first arrived. "My contact in the ranger office believes we weren't followed from Justice Mills. Still, we'll maintain our cover as the Hayes family. Most people around here mind their own business, but questions about a single woman with a newborn would draw unwanted attention." Grace had agreed without hesitation. Their marriage of convenience had become a comfortable fiction, an arrangement that provided security for Susan and preserved proprieties in a society that valued appearances. If she occasionally caught herself thinking of it as something more substantial, particularly in quiet moments when Nathaniel's guard lowered and glimpses of the man beneath the ranger emerged, she attributed it to their forced proximity and shared purpose. The sound of the front door opening pulled Grace from her reverie. Nathaniel entered, his arms laden with parcels wrapped in brown paper and string. "Supplies from the mercantile," he explained, setting his burdens on the pine table that served as both dining area and workspace. "And information?" Grace crossed to the table, curious. Over the past 2 weeks, they had established an easy rhythm. Nathaniel handling protection and investigation, Grace caring for Susan and establishing contacts among local women who might require a midwife's services. "What kind of information?" she asked, unwrapping a package to reveal coffee beans, their rich scent permeating the small room. Nathaniel removed his hat, running a hand through hair slightly damp with morning dew. "My contact in the Rangers has heard rumors about Catherine Montgomery," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "She was reportedly seen near San Antonio 3 weeks ago, heading toward a small settlement called Clear Springs. Apparently, it's where she grew up before her father's debts led to her marriage to Montgomery." Hope flared in Grace's chest. "Then she might still be alive? Susan's mother?" "It's possible," Nathaniel conceded, though his expression remained guarded. "But the timing doesn't add up perfectly. If Catherine left Susan with you and then traveled to San Antonio, she would have had to move remarkably fast. Unless someone else brought Susan to me on Catherine's behalf," Grace suggested, the possibility taking shape as she spoke. "Someone she trusted to find a safe place for her child while she led Montgomery's men away from Cottonwood Springs." Nathaniel nodded slowly. "I've considered that. It would explain why there was no sign of Catherine herself near your cabin." He began unpacking the remaining parcels. Flour, salt, dried beans, a small sack of sugar that would have been an unimaginable luxury during their journey. "Either way, it's the most substantial lead we've had." Grace watched him methodically arranging supplies, noting the careful precision that characterized all his movements. Even in this domestic task, the ranger's discipline was evident. "Will you go to San Antonio?" she asked finally, voicing the question that hung in the air between them. His hand stilled on a tin of coffee. "I'm considering it," he admitted. "It's a 4-day ride each way in good weather. That means at least 10 days away." His gray eyes met hers, troubled. "I don't like the idea of leaving you and Susan unprotected for that long." "We've had no sign of Montgomery's men since Justice Mills," Grace pointed out, "and Fort Worth is large enough that 2 women alone wouldn't draw particular notice." "2 women who happen to resemble Catherine Montgomery," Nathaniel countered. "James Collins saw you clearly enough to make the connection if he comes looking." Grace considered this, absently straightening the collar of her day dress. a new purchase made possible by the small amount of money Nathaniel had placed at her disposal. The dark blue calico was nothing fancy, but it fit well and wasn't trail-worn like the clothing she'd escaped with. "What does your instinct tell you?" she asked finally. Nathaniel leaned against the table, arms crossed over his chest. The pose might have seemed casual in another man, but in him it conveyed the controlled stillness of a predator assessing threats. "That Catherine Montgomery holds answers we need," he said after a moment. "Not just about Susan's future, but about the men who would threaten her. Information that could end this danger permanently." "Then you should go," Grace said firmly. "Susan and I will manage. I've already arranged to assist with 2 births next week, which will bring in a modest income and strengthen our cover as new settlers." Nathaniel studied her face, searching for signs of uncertainty. "You've changed since Cottonwood Springs," he observed quietly. "Circumstances change people," Grace replied. 2 months ago, I was a midwife with a predictable life in a small town. Now I'm legally married to a Texas Ranger, raising a child with a price on her head, and living under an assumed name. The recital should have sounded bitter, but instead, there was a note of something like pride in her voice, pride in her own resilience. A rare smile touched Nathaniel's lips, softening the hard planes of his face. "Fair point, Mrs. Hayes." The name still sent a curious flutter through Grace's midsection, though she'd been answering to it for weeks now. "When would you leave?" "Not for a few days yet. I want to be certain we're properly settled first." He pushed away from the table. "And I'll need to make arrangements with my contact at the ranger office," quietly. Their conversation was interrupted by Susan's frustrated cry from her quilt. Grace crossed to lift the infant, who had rolled onto her stomach and become trapped in that position. At nearly 2 months old, Susan was becoming more aware of her surroundings, more determined in her movements, and significantly more vocal about her preferences. "She has your stubbornness," Grace commented lightly, settling the baby against her shoulder, "always trying to move faster than her abilities allow." Nathaniel's expression softened as he watched them. "Seems to me she takes after her mother in that regard." The casual reference to Grace as Susan's mother brought an unexpected warmth to her cheeks. They had begun speaking of Susan this way as part of their cover, but somewhere along the line, the pretense had blurred into something that felt remarkably like truth. "I need to go to the market before the best produce is claimed," Grace said, changing the subject. "Would you mind watching Susan while I'm gone? It would be easier to navigate the stalls without her." If Nathaniel was surprised by the request, he hid it well. "Of course, though I'm not sure I'm much use if she needs feeding." "She just had her morning bottle," Grace assured him, transferring the baby to his arms. "And I won't be gone above an hour. There are clean diapers in the basket beside the bed." Nathaniel adjusted Susan against his chest with a confidence that had grown steadily over their weeks together. The sight of the hardened ranger cradling the tiny infant still struck Grace as incongruous, yet undeniably touching. "We'll manage, won't we, little one?" he murmured, his deep voice gentling, as it always did when he addressed Susan. In response, the baby gurgled and grabbed at his collar, evidently content with the arrangement. Grace gathered her market basket and a small purse containing the coins Nathaniel had given her for household expenses. At the door, she turned back, struck by the tableau they presented. Nathaniel seated in the room's single armchair, Susan nestled trustingly against his broad chest. They looked, for all the world, like any father and daughter sharing a quiet morning moment. The image stayed with her as she walked the half-mile to the town's central market, a bustling square where farmers and merchants gathered to sell their goods. May had brought plentiful spring produce, and Grace filled her basket with early peas, young onions, and fresh greens that would make a welcome change from the dried and preserved foods they had subsisted on during their journey. "That'll be 35 cents, ma'am," said the stooped farmer from whom she had purchased eggs, carefully wrapping them in clean straw and placing them in her basket. As Grace counted out coins from her purse, a voice behind her stopped her cold. A voice she hadn't heard in nearly 8 years. Yet recognized instantly. "Grace? Grace Sullivan, is that truly you?" She turned slowly, her heart hammering against her ribs. Standing behind her, hat in hand and wonder spreading across his handsome features, was Thomas Blackwood. He looked different from the gangly youth who had left Cottonwood Springs to seek his fortune. broader through the shoulders, his once boyish face now mature with a neatly trimmed beard, but his eyes were the same warm brown that had once made her 16-year-old heart race, and his smile still had the power to summon ghosts of feelings long believed buried. "Thomas," she managed, her voice sounding strange to her own ears, "what on earth are you doing in Fort Worth?" "I might ask you the same," he exclaimed, his face alight with pleasure. "I'm here on business, cattle contracts with suppliers heading north." He stepped closer, seeming to drink in the sight of her. "My God, it's been what, 8 years? 9? 8, Grace confirmed, memory supplying the precise count without effort. 8 years since Thomas had stood on her porch, full of dreams of the opportunities waiting in cattle country, promising to return once he had made something of himself. 8 years during which she had gradually stopped watching the road from town, stopped hoping for a letter, stopped waiting. "You look wonderful," he said, his gaze moving appreciatively over her face. "Just the same as I remember." Grace knew that wasn't true. The woman she had been at 20 was long gone, transformed first by years of independence and more recently by the extraordinary events of the past 2 months. Yet something of that younger Grace stirred within her at his admiring gaze. "You've changed," she said honestly. "You look prosperous." Thomas laughed, the familiar sound tugging at something deep in her memory. "I've done well enough," he admitted, without false modesty. "Blackwood Cattle Brokerage handles some of the largest herds moving through the territory now. I have an office in Dallas and agents in 3 states. "I'm glad for you, Thomas," Grace said, and found she meant it sincerely. Despite the abrupt way he had left her life, she had never wished him ill. His expression grew more serious, almost wistful. "I wrote to you, you know, several times that first year. The letters always came back marked unclaimed." Grace's brow furrowed in genuine confusion. "I never received any letters from you." "Dr. Burnett said you'd moved on," Thomas explained. "Said you'd gone to stay with relatives back east after your father's passing. By the time I learned otherwise, I was in New Mexico and—" He shrugged, the gesture conveying the complications of distance and time. Understanding dawned, bringing with it a twist of old pain. Dr. Burnett had been protective of her after Thomas's departure, had seen how his leaving had affected her. Apparently his protection had extended to intercepting Thomas's letters. "It was a long time ago," Grace said, unwilling to dwell on what might have been. "And as you can see, I remained in Cottonwood Springs, at least until recently." Thomas's face lit with renewed interest. "Yes, what brings you to Fort Worth? Are you still practicing midwifery? Are you here alone?" The rapid succession of questions reminded Grace abruptly of her current circumstances. She was no longer Grace Sullivan, independent midwife from Cottonwood Springs. She was Grace Hayes, married woman and mother, living under an assumed identity to protect a child from dangerous men. "I'm here with my husband and daughter," she said carefully, the words feeling both false and strangely true on her tongue. "We've only recently arrived. Nathaniel, my husband, has business interests here." If Thomas was disappointed by this revelation, he masked it quickly. "Married, and a mother as well." His smile remained warm, though something flickered briefly in his eyes. "I'm happy for you, Grace, truly." An awkward silence fell between them, bridging the chasm of years and divergent paths. Around them, the market continued its bustling commerce, shoppers haggling over prices and merchants calling their wares. "Perhaps you and your husband would do me the honor of dining with me one evening," Thomas suggested, breaking the impasse. "I'm staying at the Cattleman's Hotel for another week at least. I'd love to meet the man who won your heart and to hear what you've been doing these past years." Grace hesitated, acutely aware of the complexities such an invitation presented. Thomas was a connection to her past, a past that presumably remained untouched by Montgomery's reach, yet any deviation from their careful cover story risked exposing them. "That's very kind," she said finally. "I'll need to speak with Nathaniel, of course. He keeps rather irregular hours with his business affairs." Of course. Thomas reached into his vest pocket and withdrew a small card. "My information. Send word to the hotel when you're available." His fingers brushed hers as he handed over the card, the brief contact sending an unexpected jolt of awareness through her. It truly is wonderful to see you again, Grace. You were often in my thoughts. Before she could formulate a response, he had replaced his hat with a small bow and moved away through the crowded market, pausing only to glance back once with that familiar smile that had once been the sun around which her youthful dreams orbited. Grace stood motionless, the card clutched in her hand, her carefully constructed presence suddenly invaded by ghosts of the past. Thomas Blackwood, the boy she had once believed would be her future, the first young man to kindle feelings of love in her heart, the memory she had gradually packed away like a treasured dress grown too small to wear. And now he had reappeared, successful and handsome, still looking at her with warmth in his eyes, just as she found herself legally bound to another man in a marriage founded on necessity rather than affection. The irony might have been amusing if it weren't so unsettling. With deliberate calm, Grace slipped Thomas's card into her pocket and resumed her marketing, adding a small chicken to her purchases for the evening meal. Her mind, however, remained occupied with the unexpected encounter, weighing questions she had thought long since resolved. By the time she returned to their small house, she had reached no conclusions beyond the certainty that she needed to tell Nathaniel about meeting Thomas. Their agreement to maintain honesty with each other demanded nothing less. She found Nathaniel seated at the table, cleaning his revolver with the meticulous attention he gave to all tasks related to their safety. Susan slept peacefully in the wooden cradle he had purchased their first week in Fort Worth, a concession to comfort that had surprised and touched Grace. "You were gone longer than expected," he observed without looking up from his work. "I ran into someone from Cottonwood Springs," Grace replied, setting her basket on the table. "Someone I knew before." That caught his attention. Nathaniel's hands stilled on the disassembled weapon, his gaze lifting to study her face. "Someone who would recognize you as Grace Sullivan, not Hayes?" "Yes, Thomas Blackwood." She busied herself unpacking the market goods, avoiding Nathaniel's searching look. "We were friends many years ago." Something in her tone must have conveyed more than her words, for Nathaniel's expression sharpened with understanding. "More than friends, I take it." Grace nodded, oddly reluctant to elaborate. "It was a long time ago, before he left to seek his fortune in the cattle business." She arranged the vegetables on the shelf beside the small stove, her movements automatic. "He's done well for himself, has a brokerage with offices in Dallas." "And he recognized you immediately?" "Yes, he seemed quite pleased to see me." Grace finally turned to face Nathaniel directly. "He's invited us to dine with him at the Cattleman's Hotel, both of us, as husband and wife." Nathaniel absorbed this information in silence, his expression unreadable as he returned to reassembling his revolver with practiced movements. The familiar metallic clicks punctuated the quiet room. "Did you accept?" he asked finally. "I said I would need to consult with you," Grace replied. "Given our situation, I thought it prudent." Nathaniel nodded, slipping the cleaned revolver back into its holster. "Prudent indeed, though it might be equally prudent to maintain the connection. A successful businessman with no ties to Montgomery could prove useful to our cover." His pragmatic response shouldn't have disappointed her, yet Grace felt a curious deflation. What had she expected? Jealousy? Concern? Some indication that the idea of her dining with a former beau troubled him as more than a tactical consideration? "Eam believes we're genuinely married," she said, turning back to her unpacking, "with a child of our own." "Then we'd best behave as though we are," Nathaniel replied, rising from the table. He crossed to the cradle, looking down at the sleeping Susan with an expression that softened his features. For her sake, if nothing else. Grace watched him, noting the gentle way he adjusted Susan's blanket, the protective stance of his body beside the cradle. In the 2 weeks since they had arrived in Fort Worth, she had observed countless such moments, small gestures of care and tenderness from a man whose life had been defined by duty and justice rather than domestic affection. They had settled into an unexpected rhythm together, she realized. Nathaniel rising early to check the perimeter of their small property before Grace prepared breakfast. The quiet evenings when he would hold Susan while Grace sewed or read by lamplight. The careful division of household tasks that had evolved without formal discussion. Nathaniel handling the heavy work and protection, Grace managing their simple home and Susan's care. Despite themselves, they had begun functioning remarkably like the family they pretended to be. And now Thomas Blackwood had reappeared, a reminder of a different life, different possibilities. A man who had once promised Grace the very things that Nathaniel offered only as a necessary pretense. "I'll send word to him tomorrow," Grace said, her voice steadier than her thoughts. "Perhaps for 3 days hence? That should give us time to prepare our story more thoroughly." Nathaniel nodded, moving toward the door. "I need to check on Samson," he said, referring to the horse that had carried them faithfully from Cottonwood Springs. "And then I have a meeting with my ranger contact about the San Antonio lead." As the door closed behind him, Grace sank into a chair, suddenly weary despite the early hour. Susan slept on, blissfully unaware of the complexities surrounding her small existence. The meeting with Thomas had unsettled Grace more deeply than she cared to admit, stirring memories and feelings long dormant. Yet, as she gazed around the simple room that had become their temporary home, at the cradle where Susan slept and the table where Nathaniel had sat cleaning his weapon, Grace recognized a truth she had been avoiding. Somewhere along their journey, this unusual arrangement with Nathaniel had ceased to feel like mere pretense. The marriage certificate bearing their names might have been obtained under false pretenses, but the life they had begun building together in Fort Worth felt increasingly, confusingly real. And Thomas Blackwood's unexpected return had forced her to confront a question she had not allowed herself to consider. When this danger had passed, when Susan was truly safe and their arrangement no longer necessary, what then? Would she and Nathaniel simply part ways, dissolving their paper marriage as easily as they had created it? Or had something more substantial begun taking root between them, something neither had anticipated when they exchanged those expedient vows? Outside, she could hear Nathaniel speaking softly to Samson in the small stable. The familiar cadence of his deep voice carried on the spring breeze, as much a part of her daily existence now as Susan's baby sounds or the creak of the porch steps beneath her own feet. Grace touched the pocket where Thomas's card rested, a tangible link to the life and dreams she had once cherished. Then her fingers moved to the gold band on her left hand. Nathaniel's mother's ring, worn smooth by years and history she knew little about. 2 men, 2 possible futures, and a decision that, for now at least, remained as unclear as the fate that awaited them all when Nathaniel pursued the lead to San Antonio. The Cattleman's Hotel dining room boasted white linen tablecloths, crystal glassware, and a pianist in the corner playing gentle melodies on a rosewood upright. Luxuries that seemed almost foreign to Grace after months of trail meals and simple fare. Thomas Blackwood had reserved the finest table, positioned near tall windows that overlooked Fort Worth's increasingly prosperous Main Street. "I still can't believe the coincidence," Thomas said, refilling Grace's water glass with a solicitous attentiveness that hadn't wavered throughout the evening. "To think we'd both end up in Fort Worth after all these years." Beside Grace, Nathaniel maintained the pleasant expression he'd worn throughout dinner, though she had come to recognize the subtle tension in his jaw that betrayed his discomfort. He played his role convincingly, the successful author, the devoted husband, but Grace could sense his heightened vigilance, his awareness of every person who entered or left the dining room. "Coincidences do happen, Mr. Blackwood," Nathaniel replied, his tone cordial if not warm. "Though I understand Fort Worth is a natural stopping point for those in the cattle business." "Tom, please," Thomas insisted, his smile encompassing them both, though his gaze lingered on Grace. "And yes, it's become quite the cattle center. Nothing like when I first passed through in '63. Just a dusty army post then. Now look at it." He gestured toward the window, where gaslights illuminated the evening street. A proper city, with banks, hotels, even a new opera house under construction. "You've done well for yourself," Grace observed, genuinely pleased for him despite the complicated feelings his reappearance had stirred. Thomas's expression softened. "I promised I would, didn't I? All those years ago on your father's porch." His voice dropped slightly, imbuing the words with a significance that seemed directed at Grace alone. "I swore I'd come back once I had something worthwhile to offer." An awkward silence descended on the table. Nathaniel's hand moved to cover Grace's on the tablecloth. a gesture that might have appeared merely affectionate to an observer, but which she understood as a reminder of the role they played. "More coffee, gentlemen," she suggested, deliberately lightening the moment. The remainder of the dinner passed pleasantly enough, with Thomas regaling them with tales of the cattle business and Nathaniel contributing occasional anecdotes about life on the frontier, stories Grace recognized as thinly disguised versions of his ranger experiences, carefully edited to maintain their cover. When they finally took their leave, Thomas accompanied them to the hotel entrance, where Nathaniel had arranged for a hired buggy to return them to their small house. "I hope you'll allow me to call on you," Thomas said as he helped Grace into the conveyance. "Perhaps I could bring something for little Susan. I confess I know little about children, but I'm told Henley's Mercantile carries the finest toys from back east." "That's very kind," Grace replied, acutely aware of Nathaniel's silent presence beside her. "Tomorrow afternoon, perhaps?" Thomas pressed, his hand lingering on hers as he released it. "Around 3. Before Grace could respond, Nathaniel spoke. "We would be delighted to receive you, Mr. Blackwood. Our home is modest compared to your accommodations, but you're welcome nonetheless." If Thomas noted the subtle assertion of territorial rights in Nathaniel's response, he gave no indication. "Until tomorrow, then." He stepped back, tipping his hat with particular attention to Grace. "It truly was wonderful to see you again." As the buggy pulled away, Grace felt, rather than saw, Nathaniel's gaze upon her face. "He still cares for you," he said finally, his voice just audible above the clop of hooves and creak of wheels. Grace didn't pretend to misunderstand. "We were very young," she replied. "First loves often seem more significant in memory than they truly were. Was he your first love, then?" The question surprised her with its directness. She turned to study Nathaniel's profile in the intermittent glow of passing street lamps. "Yes," she admitted, "though it hardly matters now." Nathaniel's expression remained unreadable in the dim light. It seemed to matter to him. They rode the remainder of the way in silence, each lost in thoughts neither chose to share. Thomas Blackwood proved as good as his word. The following afternoon, precisely as the mantel clock struck 3, he arrived at their door bearing packages wrapped in fine paper and tied with satin ribbons. "I hope I'm not intruding," he said when Grace answered his knock. "I brought a few small things for Susan." His smile was apologetic, almost boyish in its eagerness. "And perhaps some items that might brighten your new home." Behind her, Grace was aware of Nathaniel moving into the main room from the lean-to kitchen, where he had been engaged in some project he had declined to explain that morning. "Come in, Mr. Blackwood," Nathaniel called, his tone perfectly cordial despite the wariness Grace detected beneath. "We were just about to have coffee." This was news to Grace, who had prepared no such refreshment, but she smoothly played along. "Yes, please join us. Susan is just waking from her nap." As if summoned by her name, a small cry emanated from the cradle in the corner. Thomas watched with evident fascination as Grace lifted Susan, now nearly 9 weeks old and increasingly alert to her surroundings. "She has your eyes," Thomas observed, stepping closer to study the baby's face, "the same remarkable color. Not quite green, not quite hazel." The comment, though innocent, hung awkwardly in the air. Susan's eyes were indeed changing from their newborn blue, but any resemblance to Grace was purely coincidental, a fact that underscored the complex web of pretense in which they lived. "Most say she favors her father," Grace replied carefully, settling Susan against her shoulder. Nathaniel moved beside them, his hand coming to rest at the small of Grace's back in a gesture that had become familiar over their weeks together. "Coffee's ready," he announced, "and we have some of Mrs. Peterson's shortbread from yesterday." As they settled around the small table, Thomas began presenting his gifts. A delicate silver rattle for Susan, a hand-carved wooden horse that he explained came from Germany, and a fine porcelain doll with a china face and real human hair. "She's a bit young for the doll now," he acknowledged, "but she'll grow into it." "These are far too extravagant," Grace protested, though she couldn't help admiring the craftsmanship of each item. Such luxuries had been unimaginable during her years of practical independence in Cottonwood Springs. "Nonsense," Thomas insisted. "I've no family of my own to spoil. Allow me the pleasure of bringing some small joy to the daughter of an old friend." His gaze lingered meaningfully on Grace's face. especially when I missed so many opportunities to do so in the past. Nathaniel's coffee cup met its saucer with slightly more force than necessary. Very generous, he said, his voice even despite the tension Grace sensed coiling within him. Though Susan seems equally enchanted with the wooden blocks I made for her last week. It was the first Grace had heard of such blocks, but she nodded as if they were cherished possessions. Nathaniel is quite skilled with his hands, she added, which was true enough. She had seen him clean and reassemble his revolver with remarkable dexterity. Thomas's smile remained fixed, though something flickered in his eyes, perhaps recognition of the subtle competition unfolding across the coffee cups. "I've always admired practical abilities," he said smoothly. "My own talents lie more in business matters than craftsmanship, I'm afraid." The conversation continued in this vein, superficially cordial, while undercurrents of masculine assessment flowed beneath each exchange. Thomas spoke of his growing business empire, his fine house in Dallas with its 4 bedrooms just waiting to be filled with family, and his plans to expand into breeding stock as well as brokerage. "I always planned to settle down once I had established myself properly," he said, accepting a second cup of coffee from Grace. "A man should have firm foundations before taking on the responsibilities of a wife and children." "Some responsibilities find a man, whether he's prepared or not," Nathaniel countered, his gaze dropping briefly to Susan, who had fallen asleep in Grace's arms. "And proved to be the making of him." By the time Thomas finally took his leave nearly 2 hours later, the air in the small house seemed charged with unspoken tensions. His parting words to Grace, delivered while Nathaniel retrieved his hat, carried particular weight. "I meant what I said about missed opportunities," Thomas murmured, his voice pitched for her ears alone. "Seeing you again has awakened feelings I thought long buried. I hope we might speak more, privately, before my business here concludes." Before Grace could formulate a response, Nathaniel had returned, effectively ending any possibility of private conversation. Thomas departed with promises to call again soon, leaving behind his lavish gifts and a palpable tension between Nathaniel and Grace. "He seems determined to renew your acquaintance," Nathaniel observed as they stood on the porch, watching Thomas's retreating figure. Grace sighed, bouncing Susan gently as the baby stirred against her shoulder. Thomas always was persistent once he set his mind to something. "And has he set his mind to you?" The blunt question carried no accusation, merely a request for clarity. Grace considered her response carefully. "He seems to harbor regrets about our past," she said finally. "Though what he truly wants, I couldn't say." Nathaniel's expression was unreadable as he held the door for her to re-enter their small home. "I think it's quite clear what he wants, Grace." The following week brought several changes to their household routine. First, Nathaniel announced that he needed to postpone his planned trip to San Antonio, citing concerns about recent Comanche activity along the route. A plausible reason that nonetheless struck Grace as convenient timing given Thomas Blackwood's persistent attention. Second, Nathaniel began undertaking household tasks he had previously left to Grace. She returned from attending a birth to find him in the kitchen, surrounded by flour and wearing an expression of grim determination as he wrestled with what appeared to be bread dough. "I thought I'd attempt biscuits for supper," he explained, his usually confident voice carrying a note of uncertainty. "Mrs. Peterson mentioned they were your favorite. The results were nearly inedible. Hard as rocks on the outside, doughy in the center." But Grace ate too with exaggerated enjoyment, touched by the effort behind the disaster. Next came his announcement that Susan had outgrown her cradle. "She needs a proper bed," he declared 3 days after the biscuit incident. "Something she can use as she grows." Grace had agreed, assuming he meant to purchase such an item from the woodworker in town. Instead, she woke from a nap to the sound of hammering behind the house. She found Nathaniel surrounded by planks of pine and oak, the beginnings of a small bed taking shape beneath his hands. "You're building it yourself?" she asked, unable to keep the surprise from her voice. Nathaniel looked up, a sheen of perspiration on his forehead and a smudge of sawdust across one cheek. "My father taught all his sons basic carpentry," he said, as if this explained everything. "A man should be able to shelter his family with his own hands." The bed, when completed 3 days later, was sturdy and functional, if slightly lopsided. Nathaniel had carved Susan's name into the headboard with painstaking precision, the letters flowing with unexpected artistry. "It's beautiful," Grace said honestly, running her fingers over the carved name. "She'll treasure it for years to come." Something flickered in Nathaniel's eyes at her words, pleasure at the praise mixed with an emotion Grace couldn't quite identify. "It should see her through until she's 5 or 6, he said gruffly. "By then she'll need something larger." The implication that he imagined himself present in Susan's life years hence hung in the air between them, neither willing to examine it too closely. The most surprising change came when Grace was called to attend a difficult birth across town. She had arranged for Mrs. Peterson next door to watch Susan, as she had for previous deliveries. "I'll accompany you," Nathaniel announced instead, already settling Susan into the sling Grace had fashioned for carrying her. "Mrs. Peterson mentioned her sister is visiting from Dallas. We shouldn't impose. A birth is no place for a man," Grace protested, "especially not with Susan along." "The child's father will presumably be present," Nathaniel countered. "And Susan will stay with me in an adjoining room while you attend to your duties. I'm perfectly capable of caring for her for a few hours." His tone brooked no argument, though Grace suspected his insistence had less to do with Mrs. Peterson's visiting sister and more to do with Thomas Blackwood's most recent visit, during which he had hinted at escorting Grace to an upcoming town social. The birth proved long and difficult, a breech presentation that required all of Grace's skill and focus to resolve successfully. Through the grueling hours, she was vaguely aware of Nathaniel's presence in the next room, his deep voice occasionally audible as he spoke soothingly to Susan. When the crisis finally passed and a healthy boy was delivered safely into his mother's arms, Grace emerged exhausted to find Nathaniel pacing the farmhouse's small parlor, Susan asleep against his chest. His expression as he turned to Grace was unlike any she had seen before, a mixture of relief, admiration, and profound respect. "I heard," he said simply. "The father told me how close it was, how you saved them both." Grace nodded, too drained to elaborate. "It's what I'm trained to do." "I've faced armed men with more composure than that poor fellow showed," Nathaniel continued, his voice hushed to avoid waking Susan. "He said if not for your steady hands and calm voice, his wife would surely have died. Many midwives could have done the same," Grace demurred, though his words warmed something deep within her. "I watched you ride out to face a difficult birth with the same resolve I've seen in rangers facing a gunfight," Nathaniel said, his gray eyes intent on her face. "Yet you bring life where we so often deal in death." A smile touched his lips, though I confess, when the father described the birth itself, I felt rather lightheaded. Grace couldn't help but smile. Texas Ranger Nathaniel Hayes, scourge of outlaws across the territory, felled by the mere description of childbirth? "It appears I have unexpected weaknesses," he admitted, a rare self-deprecating humor lighting his expression, though I maintain it was the lack of proper supper rather than any deficiency of courage. The moment of shared amusement, of genuine connection beyond their assumed roles, lingered between them as they rode home in the pre-dawn light. Susan slept peacefully in the sling across Grace's chest, and Nathaniel rode beside them, watchful and protective as always, yet somehow changed, more accessible, more human than the duty-bound ranger who had arrived at her cabin months earlier. Thomas Blackwood's visits continued with increasing frequency over the following week. He brought more gifts. A fine shawl for Grace that she reluctantly accepted, horehound candy that he remembered she had favored as a girl, a book of poetry he had carried all the way from New Orleans with her specifically in mind. Each offering came with reminiscences of their shared past and barely veiled suggestions of what might have been, what might still be, had circumstances been different. His attention was flattering, his conversation engaging, his genuine affection for her evident in every glance and gesture. Yet Grace found herself increasingly distracted during his visits. Her awareness centered not on Thomas, but on Nathaniel's response to his presence. The subtle stiffening of his shoulders when Thomas addressed her with particular warmth, the careful way he positioned himself in the room, always maintaining clear sightlines to both Grace and Susan. the controlled precision of his movements that spoke of emotions held rigidly in check. It was behavior she had observed before in expecting fathers men caught between pride in their wives and a primitive, territorial instinct they scarcely understood themselves. But Nathaniel was neither expecting father nor true husband, despite the legal document that bound them. Their arrangement remained one of necessity and mutual protection, nothing more. Or so she had believed. The revelation came on an ordinary evening with no particular catalyst beyond the accumulated tensions of the preceding weeks. Thomas had called that afternoon, bringing a delicate silver bracelet for Susan to wear when she's older, and speaking at length about his plans to expand his Dallas home with gardens specifically designed for children to explore safely. After his departure, Nathaniel had been unusually quiet, withdrawing to the small stable to tend to Samson with meticulous attention. By the time he returned, twilight had settled over Fort Worth, and Grace had put Susan to bed in the handcrafted crib that represented hours of Nathaniel's determined labor. "I've been thinking," Grace said as they sat at the small table, lamplight casting warm shadows across the room. "Perhaps it would be best if you proceeded with your journey to San Antonio as planned. The Comanche raids you mentioned have moved north, according to Mrs. Peterson's husband." Nathaniel looked up from the cup of coffee he had been contemplating, his expression guarded. "You seem eager to have me go?" "Not eager," Grace corrected, "but practical. If Catherine Montgomery is truly alive, we need to know. For Susan's sake, if nothing else. And would Thomas Blackwood's increasingly transparent courtship have anything to do with this practicality?" The question carried no accusation, merely a directness that had characterized their relationship from the beginning. Grace met his gaze steadily. "Thomas's attention is flattering, but irrelevant to our situation. My concern is for Susan's future, and for resolving the danger that brought us together in the first place." "And once that danger is resolved?" Nathaniel set his cup down carefully. "Have you considered what happens then, Grace, when we no longer need this arrangement for Susan's protection?" The question struck at the heart of thoughts Grace had been carefully avoiding. "I assumed we would proceed as agreed," she said, her voice less certain than she intended. "An annulment once Susan is safe, allowing us both to return to our former lives. Is that what you want?" Nathaniel's gaze held hers, unblinking. "To return to Cottonwood Springs? Or perhaps to accept Thomas Blackwood's increasingly obvious invitation to a different future?" "I don't know what I want," Grace admitted, startled by her own honesty. 2 months ago, my life seemed settled, predictable. Now everything has changed, and I find myself legally bound to a man I barely knew then, raising a child who isn't mine by birth, but whom I've come to love as if she were, and being courted by someone I once thought lost to me forever. She drew a steadying breath. "It's a great deal to reconcile." Nathaniel rose abruptly, moving to the window where he stood silhouetted against the gathering darkness. For a long moment he remained silent, his shoulders tense beneath his cotton shirt. "I've been unfair to you," he said finally, his voice pitched low. "Attempting to compete with Blackwood as if I had any right to do so. The biscuits, the bed for Susan, even accompanying you to that birth. All childish efforts to assert a claim I have no business making. No, let me finish." He turned to face her, his expression more vulnerable than she had ever witnessed. "The truth is, I've been lying to myself as much as to Blackwood. Pretending this marriage is merely a practical arrangement when in fact it has become something far more significant to me." Grace stared at him, her pulse suddenly quick in her throat. "I find myself imagining a future beyond our current crisis," Nathaniel continued, the words emerging as if despite himself. "A future where Susan grows up calling me father in truth not just for appearance's sake, where you and I build something permanent from these temporary foundations." He raked a hand through his dark hair, a gesture of uncharacteristic uncertainty. "It's presumptuous, I know. You never asked for any of this. Not Susan, not a paper marriage to a ranger with enemies at every turn, certainly not the complications my presence brings to your life." "Nathaniel," Grace began again, rising to her feet, but he shook his head. Thomas Blackwood can offer you stability, respectability, comfort, all the things a woman deserves. He has no blood on his hands, no outlaws seeking vengeance against him. He could give Susan advantages I never could." His voice roughened. "I'd understand if you chose that path once our arrangement concludes. It would be the sensible choice." "And when have I ever made the sensible choice?" Grace asked softly, taking a step toward him. "I chose to become a midwife instead of seeking a husband. I chose to take in an abandoned infant with no knowledge of the dangers that followed her. I chose to flee with a stranger on the strength of his badge and his word." Another step brought her within arm's reach of him. "Sensible choices have never been my particular talent." Something kindled in Nathaniel's eyes. A flicker of hope quickly banked. "What are you saying, Grace?" "I'm saying that I don't know what the future holds for any of us," she replied honestly. "But I do know that when Thomas speaks of his fine house in Dallas, of the life he could provide, I find myself thinking not of comfort or security, but of this." She gestured to the small room around them, to Susan sleeping peacefully in her slightly crooked crib. "Of what we've built here, temporary though it may be." Nathaniel's hand moved as if to reach for her, then dropped back to his side. "I have no right to ask anything of you," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Our arrangement was meant to protect Susan, nothing more." "Yet it has become something more," Grace said quietly. "Hasn't it?" The question hung between them, charged with possibilities neither had fully acknowledged until this moment. Nathaniel's gaze held hers, all pretense stripped away, revealing the man beneath the ranger's disciplined exterior. A man who had, against all expectation, developed feelings for both the child and the woman fate had placed in his path. Before he could respond, a sharp knock at the door shattered the moment. Nathaniel's hand moved instinctively to the revolver at his hip, his expression shifting instantly from vulnerability to alertness. "Stay back," he murmured, moving toward the door with the controlled precision that spoke of years of training. "Who's there?" "Message for Ranger Hayes," came a young voice from outside. "From Captain Markham. Says it's urgent." Nathaniel's gaze met Grace's briefly before he opened the door, revealing a gangly youth of perhaps 16 in the dust-covered clothing of a dispatch rider. "Captain said to deliver this personal-like," the boy said, handing over a sealed envelope. "Said it couldn't wait till morning." Nathaniel pressed a coin into the youth's palm. "You've ridden hard. There's a livery 2 streets over that keeps decent rooms for travelers." The boy touched his hat respectfully. "Much obliged, sir." As the door closed behind the messenger, Nathaniel broke the seal on the envelope, his expression growing increasingly focused as he read the contents. "It's from my contact in San Antonio," he said, looking up at Grace. "They've located a woman matching Catherine Montgomery's description in a small settlement 30 miles outside the city. She's living under the name Catherine Miller, working as a seamstress for a prominent family." Grace's heart quickened. "She's alive?" "It appears so." Nathaniel refolded the letter, his movements measured despite the significance of the news. "Captain Markham suggests I proceed immediately to verify her identity." The implications hung between them. If Catherine Montgomery truly lived, Susan's future, and by extension their own, might take a dramatically different course than either had anticipated. "When will you leave?" Grace asked, practical considerations temporarily overriding the emotional conversation that had been interrupted. Nathaniel hesitated, his gaze moving to the crib where Susan slept, then back to Grace's face. "That depends," he said finally, "on whether you want me to go at all." The question contained layers of meaning beyond the immediate decision. Was he asking about this specific journey, or about the larger question of his continued presence in their lives? Did he seek her blessing to pursue Susan's mother, or her permission to imagine a future where that pursuit might prove unnecessary? "Susan deserves to know if her mother lives," Grace said carefully. "And Catherine deserves to know her daughter is safe, if indeed it is her." She drew a steadying breath. "But I think you should send someone else. Captain Markham, perhaps, or another ranger you trust." Surprise flickered across Nathaniel's features. "You don't want me to confirm her identity personally?" "I don't want you to leave," Grace clarified, her voice steady despite the vulnerability of the admission. "Not when so much remains unresolved between us." The stark honesty of her words seemed to catch him off guard. For a moment he stood motionless, the letter from Captain Markham still clutched in his hand. Then he crossed the small space between them in 2 strides, his free hand coming up to cradle her cheek with a gentleness that belied his strength. "Grace," he murmured, her name carrying a wealth of emotion in his deep voice. The sound of Susan stirring in her crib broke the moment. Grace stepped back, suddenly aware of how close they had come to crossing a boundary neither had acknowledged until tonight. "We should discuss this further when we're both less tired," she said, moving toward the crib where Susan had begun to fuss. "And you should reply to Captain Markham tonight, if the messenger is to leave at first light." Nathaniel nodded, though his gaze remained fixed on her face as if memorizing its contours. "Of course." As Grace lifted Susan, soothing her with practiced movements, she felt the weight of unspoken words between them. Nathaniel's unexpected confession, her own admission that their arrangement had become something more meaningful than either had intended. And now, the possibility that Catherine Montgomery lived, introducing a new variable into an equation already complex with emotion and obligation. Whatever resolution they might have reached had been postponed, but not forgotten. The truth had been spoken aloud, impossible now to retract or ignore. What had begun as necessity had evolved into choice. What had been pretense now contained seeds of genuine feeling. Whether those seeds would flourish or wither remained to be seen. But as Susan settled back to sleep and Nathaniel seated himself at the table to compose his response to Captain Markham, Grace found herself facing a future far different from any she had imagined when she first discovered a newborn on her porch so many weeks ago.